The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. For nearly 3,000 years, that sentiment has been the heartbeat of the world's greatest stage. The Olympics aren't just about gold medals or world records. They are a mirror to our humanity, reflecting our deepest prejudices, our wildest eccentricities, and our most breathtaking moments of resilience. From the ancient dust of Olympia to the digital glow of Tokyo, the flame has survived it all: war, politics, and the sheer beautiful unpredictability of the human spirit. You've just hit play on a definitive journey through the history of the Games, but this isn't a stressful history lecture. We've designed this 3-hour experience for you to lean back, relax, and lose yourself in the stories that shaped our world. Whether you're winding down for the night or just need a long, meaningful escape, this is a space to witness the triumphs and the tragedies that prove we are always capable of more. Before we dive into the archives, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep the flame alive for future documentaries. And once you're settled in, drop a comment below. Tell us which Olympic moment has stayed with you the longest. The stadium is full. The world is watching. I declare the Games open. Born in blood and olive oil, the story begins with a lie, a powerful, enduring myth, repeated in countless books, documentaries, and schoolrooms. It is Berlin, 1936. The Olympic Stadium is a monument to Nazi ambition. Jesse Owens, the African-American sprinter from Alabama, has just humiliated the Third Reich's ideology of Aryan supremacy with his 4 gold medals. And then, the story goes, as Owens stood victorious, Adolf Hitler, the Führer himself, refused to shake his hand. A snub heard around the world. A perfect allegory of prejudice meeting excellence. It is a compelling narrative, clean in its moral divide. But it is not what happened. The truth is more nuanced, and in its complexity, far more revealing of the Olympic spectacle itself. Hitler did not shake Owens's hand, but not in the dramatic public rebuff of legend. On the first day of competition, Hitler had congratulated several German and Finnish winners in his private box. Olympic officials, fearing a diplomatic incident if he selectively acknowledged athletes, advised him to either greet all victors or none. Hitler chose the latter. He avoided the medal ceremonies altogether. Owens himself later said, "Hitler didn't snub me, it was our president who snubbed me." He referred to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who never invited the champion to the White House. The myth persists because it serves a purpose. It simplifies the messy, political reality of the Games into a fable. It reminds us that from their very inception, the Olympics have never been just about sport. They are a stage where human ambition, politics, identity, and propaganda collide. Oh, understand how the Olympics became this stage for propaganda and myth-making. We must travel back 2,500 years, not to 1936, but to the very beginning. To a quiet valley in Greece where the Games were born in blood and olive oil, in religious ritual and deadly competition. This is not a story of pristine amateurism and global harmony. This is the truth, born in blood and olive oil. Our journey takes us to a quiet, grassy valley in the western Peloponnese of Greece, a place called Olympia. The postcards and history books often present it as the birthplace of a pure athletic ideal. We imagine a city dedicated to sport, a kind of ancient athletic capital. But that image is our first misconception. Olympia was not a city. It was a sanctuary, a temenos, a sacred precinct cut off from the mundane world. For most of the 4-year cycle between Games, it was a quiet backwater, home to a few priests and caretakers. There were no permanent inhabitants in the way a polis, a city-state like Athens or Sparta, had citizens. It was a collection of temples, altars, training facilities, and administrative buildings nestled between 2 rivers, the Alpheos and the Clodeos. Its heart was not a stadium, but the Altis, the sacred grove of Zeus, king of the gods. The towering gold and ivory statue of Zeus by the sculptor Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, sat in his temple here. This context is crucial. The Games were not a secular sports festival. They were a religious ritual, a threskaia. Every sprint, every discus throw, every brutal wrestling match was an act of worship, an offering to the Father of the Gods. The athletes competed not for personal glory alone, but to honor Zeus and, by extension, bring honor to their hometowns. The Olympics were, at their core, a massive, pan-Hellenic religious gathering where the primary liturgy was physical competition. The origins of this ritual are shrouded in the mists of myth. The official story, promoted heavily in antiquity, linked the Games to the ultimate Greek hero, Heracles. It was said that after completing his 12 labors, Heracles measured out the stadion, the original sprint track, and founded the Games to celebrate his victory. A noble, heroic pedigree, but archaeology and older strands of poetry point to a darker, more primal origin. The site of Olympia was ancient, a place of worship long before the first recorded Games in 776 BCE. Older legends connect it to a funeral. The hero Pelops, for whom the Peloponnese is named, sought the hand of Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus. The king challenged all suitors to a chariot race, with death as the penalty for loss. Pelops won through cunning or divine aid, but Oenomaus died in the process. To honor the dead king, or to purify himself from the bloodshed, Pelops held funeral games at Olympia. This version is telling. In the Greek world, athletic contests were a fundamental part of honoring the dead. The epic heroes in Homer's Iliad hold elaborate games after the funeral of Patroclus. These games are violent, competitive, and rife with disputes over prizes and honor. They are not about unity, but about asserting individual arete excellence, in a world defined by strife. The Olympic Games likely grew from this soil, from local funeral rites that gradually expanded into a grand, regional festival for Zeus. The myth of Heracles provided a more sanitized, pan-Hellenic founding myth, but the ghost of Pelops and his deadly chariot race never truly left the stadium. The Games always carried the echo of funeral rites, a celebration of life and strength held in the shadow of mortality. And what of the events themselves? The modern imagination might picture noble discus throwers in graceful poses inspired by classical statues. The reality was far more visceral, often brutal to the point of lethality. The Olympic program evolved over centuries. It began with a single foot race, the stadion, a sprint, the length of the stadium about 192 meters. Over time, more races were added. The diolos, 2 lengths, the dolikos, a long-distance run, and the hoplitodromos, where runners competed in full military armor. There were field events, the discus, javelin, and the long jump, which athletes performed while holding weights or halteres to propel themselves forward. Then there was wrestling, boxing, and the notorious pankration. Wrestling was a test of strength and technique, but boxing, or pix, was savage. Fighters wrapped their hands and wrists with leather straps called himantes, which over time evolved from simple protection to weapons, with hard leather and sometimes metal inserts. There were no rounds, no weight classes. The fight continued until one man surrendered, lost consciousness, or died. Blows were concentrated on the head and face. The poet Pindar matter-of-factly wrote of a boxer, his opponent, looking for a landing, did not spare him, but like a bronze-wielding smith, hammered his face with blows. But even boxing was governed by some rules compared to the pankration. Translating to all power, or all force, pankration was a no-holds-barred combat sport, blending wrestling, boxing, and street fighting. Only biting and gouging the eyes were forbidden, though evidence suggests even these rules were sometimes ignored. Every other technique was legal: punches, kicks, elbow strikes, knee strikes, joint locks, and chokeholds. The goal was to force submission. A famous victor, Erychion, won his crown posthumously. As his opponent had him in a fatal chokehold, Erychion managed to dislocate his opponent's ankle. The opponent tapped out in surrender, but the strain of the maneuver had simultaneously broken Erychion's neck. The judges awarded the dead man the victory. This was the ultimate expression of the Olympic spirit for the ancients. Victory, even in death, was eternal glory. The most prestigious and most dangerous event was not an athletic contest in the modern sense at all, the chariot race. Held in the hippodrome, it was a spectacle of wealth, technology, and sheer terror. Unlike the athletes, the charioteers were usually not the owners. The victor's crown went to the owner of the winning team, not the driver. This allowed wealthy aristocrats and even tyrants and kings to compete for Olympic glory through their wealth and stables. The race itself was a chaotic, deadly affair. Up to 40 chariots, each pulled by 4 horses, would line up behind a starting gate system designed to ensure a fair start. Once released, it was a mad dash of dust, flying hooves and splintering wood. The track was long, with tight turns around posts at each end. Collisions were not just common, they were expected. Chariots would overturn, horses would stumble, drivers would be trampled or dragged. The poet Pindar describes a race where only 1 chariot out of 40 finished. The rest were destroyed in a massive pile-up. This event was a potent metaphor for the games and for Greek life. Immense prestige awaited the victor, but the path was littered with the wreckage of the ambitious. It was a demonstration of power, both equine and economic, and a visceral reminder that the pursuit of glory was a deadly serious business. The cheers of the crowd were mingled with the screams of horses and the crunch of collisions. This was not a sanitized sport, it was a ritualized version of the chaos and competition that defined the ancient world. Amidst this brutal competition, however, there existed a profound and famous ideal, the Olympic truce, or ekakeria, meaning holding of hands. For the duration of the games, and for the travel to and from Olympia, a sacred truce was declared across the Greek world. Wars were to be suspended, legal disputes put on hold, and death penalties postponed. Safe passage was guaranteed for all athletes, spectators, and officials traveling to the sanctuary. This truce is often held up as the purest Olympic ideal, an ancient precursor to the modern hope that sport can transcend conflict. And in practice, it did allow the pan-Hellenic gathering to occur. Athletes from perpetually warring city-states like Athens and Sparta could compete side by side. But to view it as a naive peace treaty is to misunderstand its function. The truce was a religious necessity. Olympia was a sacred zone belonging to Zeus. To spill blood through warfare during the festival was an act of sacrilege, inviting divine wrath. It was a practical measure to ensure the ritual could be performed correctly, not a humanitarian one to end wars. Furthermore, the truce did not erase political tensions, it merely relocated them. City-states used the festival to showcase their power, wealth, and cultural superiority. They built treasuries, small temple-like buildings along the Altis to store offerings and impress rivals. Athletes were overt representatives of their polis. Victory was a direct sign of divine favor for the hometown. The announcement of a victor was not just Kroisos of Athens, but Kroisos, an Athenian. The glory belonged to the man, but the honor reflected on his city. Rivalries were fierce. In one famous incident, the Spartan Lycus entered a chariot team under the banner of a different city-state after Sparta had been banned from the games. When his horses won, he rushed onto the track to crown his charioteer, revealing his ownership. The officials had him publicly flogged for the deception. The truce prevented outright battle at the site, but the games were a continuation of politics by other, intensely physical, means. Who were the men who competed in this arena? The modern concept of the amateur athlete, competing solely for the love of the sport, would have been utterly alien to an ancient Greek. While there was no professional athletic circuit in the early centuries, Olympic competitors were far from amateurs in the modern sense. They were almost exclusively drawn from the aristocratic and wealthy classes. Training for the Olympics was a full-time, years-long endeavor requiring significant resources, time for practice, money for a specialized diet, heavy in meat, a luxury, and access to expert coaches. For the chariot race, one needed the fortune to breed, train, and maintain a team of horses. These men competed for immense, tangible rewards. The official prize at Olympia was simple, a wreath made from the sacred wild olive tree, cut with a golden sickle from a grove behind the Temple of Zeus. This Catino's wreath had no monetary value, but its symbolic value was incalculable. To return home as an Olympic victor, an Olympianics, was to achieve the highest social status imaginable. The victor was greeted as a hero. He would often be granted free meals for life at public expense, a pension, and the best seats at civic festivals. Poets like Pindar were commissioned to write victory odes, immortalizing the athlete's name and family. Cities would tear down sections of their defensive walls to welcome him home, declaring that a city with such men needed no walls. Some victors were even worshipped as semi-divine figures after death. The material rewards were also substantial. Many city-states offered huge cash bonuses to their Olympic champions. The financial incentives were so great that over time, especially in the Roman period, a class of true professional athletes emerged, touring the circuit of major games for prize money. The olive wreath was the crown of an honor that translated directly into social capital, political influence, and wealth. Two other defining aspects of the ancient athlete were nudity and olive oil. Greek athletes competed naked. The origin of this practice was itself mythologized. One story claims a runner's loincloth fell off mid-race and he won, so nudity became the rule. Historians suggest it reflected a cultural ideal of masculine beauty, a celebration of the human form as a creation of the gods, and a deliberate distinction from barbarian peoples who competed clothed. Nudity also served a practical purpose in the hot Greek sun, but its primary function was symbolic. It stripped the athlete of all civic identity. In a world defined by city-state allegiance, the naked body in the stadium was a human being in its most fundamental state, with only its training and innate ability on display. It was a great equalizer, at least in theory. In practice, an athlete's style and physique were still markers of his background. But the ritual anointing of the body with olive oil before competition added another layer. Athletes would cover themselves in oil, then dust themselves with fine sand. This created a protective layer, kept the skin cool, and highlighted the muscular definition of the body, making it gleam under the sun like a living statue. The oil also had practical uses in wrestling, making it harder for an opponent to get a firm grip. After competition, they would use a strigil, a curved metal tool, to scrape off the mixture of oil, sweat, and dust. This ritual of oiling and scraping was a fundamental part of athletic culture, a sensory experience linking the body to the earth and the sacred. For nearly 12 centuries, the Olympic Games persisted, adapting to the seismic shifts in the Mediterranean world. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great saw the Games continue, but now under the shadow of a hegemonic power. Philip himself famously won Olympic chariot races, using the victory for propaganda. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander remained enthusiastic patrons. But the true transformation came with the rise of Rome. Initially, the Romans viewed the Games as a quaint Greek tradition. As they absorbed Greece into their empire, the Olympics were incorporated into the Roman sporting world. This had a profound effect. The Roman love of spectacle and professionalism began to alter the character of the festival. The ideal of the citizen athlete faded. A transnational class of professional competitors emerged, traveling from game to game in Greece and Asia Minor, living off prizes and appearance fees. The Olympics remained prestigious, but they became more of a cultural tourist attraction for the Roman elite. Emperors like Nero infamously manipulated the games for personal glory, adding musical contests to the program so he could compete and, of course, win, despite reportedly singing badly and leaving the chariot race early. The religious core of the festival also faced a fundamental challenge with the rise of Christianity. The Olympic Games were an intrinsically pagan festival, a ritual dedicated to Zeus. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius I, such pagan practices came under increasing pressure. In 393 AD, Theodosius issued a series of decrees banning pagan festivals. The 293rd Olympic Games, held that year, are traditionally considered the last of the ancient world. The sanctuary at Olympia fell into disuse. Earthquakes and floods eventually buried it under layers of silt from the Alpheus River. The memory of the games faded into legend, kept alive only in classical texts, while the physical site slept for over 1,000 years. The modern world's rediscovery of Olympia was not a single moment, but a gradual reawakening driven by the romantic fascination with antiquity and the birth of scientific archaeology. For centuries, travelers to the region knew that somewhere near the village of Archaea, Olympia, lay the ruins of the famous sanctuary, but its exact location was obscured. In the 18th century, European antiquarians began to search in earnest. The pivotal moment came in the 19th century. In 1766, the English antiquarian Richard Chandler identified the site. But the systematic excavation began in 1829, when a French expedition partially uncovered the Temple of Zeus. Their most dramatic find was a series of metopes, sculpted panels, depicting the labours of Heracles, which were shipped to the Louvre. The real transformation, however, began in 1875, under the direction of the German archaeologist Ernst Curtius. With meticulous Prussian organization and funding from the German government, Curtius and his team began a large-scale systematic excavation that would continue for decades. They uncovered the outlines of the Altis, the stadium, the palestra, the gymnasium, and the foundations of the treasuries. They mapped the entire sanctuary, bringing the scale and layout of the ancient games back to light. The finds were breathtaking. Exquisite sculptures like the Nike of Paionios and the Hermes of Praxiteles, thousands of inscriptions detailing victors' names and rules, and countless artifacts of daily athletic life, strigils, votive offerings, and weights. This archaeological resurrection of Olympia coincided perfectly with a growing international movement promoting physical education and international understanding. The ruins provided a tangible physical link to a revered past. They offered a pedigree. For men like Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the French educator dreaming of reviving the games for the modern age, Olympia was not just an inspiration, it was a mandate from history. The stones spoke of a tradition that could be reclaimed, reinterpreted, and repurposed for a new, industrializing world hungry for ideals of peace and human excellence. The myth of the ancient games, now filtered through both archaeological fact and romantic idealism, was ready to be reborn. The stones of Olympia had been sleeping for 1,000 years. But they were about to be awakened by a Frenchman with a bold, impossible dream, to resurrect the ancient games for a modern world that would twist them in ways the Greeks never imagined. This brings us to the Eccentric Revival. The Eccentric Revival. In the collective imagination, the Olympic Games are a radiant inheritance, a pure flame passed directly from the hands of ancient Greek athletes to our modern world. We picture marble statues coming to life, discus throwers in sun-drenched stadia, and the sacred truce of Elis. This is the powerful, elegant origin story we have been told, but the truth of the modern Olympics' rebirth is far stranger, more contingent, and deeply human. It is a tale not of classical ideals seamlessly revived, but of a peculiar French aristocrat's obsession, a bankrupt kingdom's gamble, and a series of chaotic, almost farcical events that somehow, against all odds, coalesced into a global institution. This is the story of the Eccentric Revival, a 20-year period of experimentation, absurdity, and fleeting glory that would determine whether the Olympic idea could survive its own rebirth. Our journey begins not on the sun-baked plains of Olympia, but in the misty playing fields of Victorian England. The man we credit as the founder of the modern games, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, was indeed a classicist, a dreamer who spoke eloquently of youthful muscles and clear minds. But his true inspiration, the model he sought to replicate on a world stage, was not the ancient Greek gymnasium. It was the British public school system. In the late 19th century, Coubertin was a reformer, deeply worried about the spirit of France, which he saw as weakened and humiliated after the Franco-Prussian War. He made several pilgrimages to England, enthralled by the ethos of schools like rugby, immortalized by Thomas Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days. Here he witnessed a philosophy where sport was not merely recreation, it was the forge of character, the crucible for creating leaders of empire. Games like rugby and football were taught as moral lessons in teamwork, perseverance and coolness under pressure, what the British called pluck. Coubertin became convinced that France's youth needed this athletic education. He saw in organized amateur sport a secular religion capable of building stronger men and, by extension, a stronger nation. His initial idea was not an international festival, but a national one. However, his vision expanded, colored by a romantic, somewhat misinterpreted view of the ancient Olympics. He began to envision a modern, international version that would serve as a peaceful arena for competition, fostering understanding and excellence. Yet the core engine of this vision remained the British ideal of muscular Christianity, stripped of its overt religiosity, the belief that sport built moral fiber. This was a crucial, often overlooked foundation. The Olympics would not be a mere athletic carnival. For Coubertin, they were a pedagogical tool, a means of social and moral engineering for the modern age. His was a French mind, inspired by English practice, dreaming of a Greek ideal. This complex fusion would shape everything to come. Having sown the intellectual seeds, Coubertin needed a stage. In 1894, at an international congress on amateur sport in Paris, he finally proposed his grand idea, the revival of the Olympic Games. The reception was cautiously optimistic. A committee was formed, the International Olympic Committee, a self-perpetuating group of aristocrats and enthusiasts. A location was chosen, Paris, for the year 1900. But then, a voice of passionate intervention altered the course of history. A Greek delegate, the writer Demetrios Vikalas, who would become the first IOC president, made an eloquent plea. If the Games were to be reborn, should they not first return to their ancestral home? Should not Athens have the honor of hosting the inaugural modern celebration? The symbolism was irresistible. Coubertin, though perhaps wary of the logistical challenges, was swayed. The date was moved up. The first modern Olympic Games would be in Athens in 1896. This decision plunged Greece into a frenzy of both national pride and profound anxiety. The country in the 1890s was poor, politically unstable, and still defining its modern identity. The idea of hosting the world, of reclaiming this pinnacle of ancient glory, was intoxicating. It was a chance to show a modern Greece to a Europe that saw it largely as a museum. King George I and the government threw their support behind the project. But quickly, the dream collided with grim financial reality. The cost of building a suitable stadium, the magnificent white marble Panathenaic Stadium, a reconstruction of an ancient site, was staggering. A national fundraising effort was launched. Stamp issues, private donations, and even a special set of commemorative coins were sold. The most crucial contribution came from a wealthy Alexandrian Greek businessman, Georgios Averrof, who funded the stadium's reconstruction entirely. Without his philanthropy, the Games would have foundered. The organization was haphazard, the invitations sent out late. Many nations were skeptical or simply unaware. There was no standardized process for selecting teams. Often, it was individuals who decided to make the journey at their own expense. The United States team, for instance, was largely comprised of college athletes from Boston and Princeton who paid their way believing it was a minor international meet. As athletes began to arrive in Athens in early April 1896, the scale of the endeavor was still a question mark. The opening ceremony, however, dispelled all doubts. On April 6th, the stadium was packed with over 60,000 spectators, the largest crowd ever to watch a sporting event in Greece. King George I declared the games open, doves were released, and the hymn to the Olympic spirit echoed through the marble horseshoe. The eccentric dream was now a tangible, breathtaking reality. The competitions themselves were a curious mix of the ancient and the improvised. There were no gold medals. Winners received silver medals and olive branches. Runners-up got copper medals and laurel. The events included track and field, cycling, fencing, gymnastics, shooting, swimming, tennis, weightlifting, and wrestling. The swimming events were held in the cold, open waters of the Bay of Zia. The American competitors, used to cinder tracks, found the soft clay surface of the stadium track strange. Yet, amidst the novelty, excellence emerged. An American from Harvard, James Conley, won the triple jump to become the first Olympic champion in over 1,500 years. But for all the international success, the heart of these games, and the moment that would cement their place in Greek national consciousness, was yet to come. It lay in a new event, invented for these games, inspired by the legend of Pheidippides, the marathon. The idea came from a French linguist and friend of Coubertin, Michel Bréal. He proposed a long-distance race tracing the legendary route from the town of Marathon to Athens, a distance of about 40 kilometers. For the Greeks, this was more than a race, it was a chance to reenact a foundational myth of endurance and victory. The nation was desperate for a Greek winner. After days of competition dominated by foreigners, particularly the Americans, the marathon offered a final, epic opportunity for national glory. On the morning of April 10th, 17 runners gathered in the town of Marathon. Among them was Spiridon Louis, a 24-year-old water carrier from the nearby village of Marousi. He was not a trained athlete in the modern sense, but a man whose profession involved traversing long distances with heavy loads. He was sturdy, humble, and unknown. The race commenced under a hot sun. Early leaders set a fierce pace, but one by one they succumbed to the brutal distance and the conditions. News travelled slowly back to the stadium in Athens, where anticipation had reached a fever pitch. As the minutes turned to hours, the crowd of over 60,000 grew restless. Then, a cannon shot echoed in the distance. A messenger raced into the stadium and to the royal box. A Greek was in the lead. The atmosphere exploded into electric anticipation. Finally, Spiridon Louis entered the stadium gate, his figure tired but moving with steady determination. The eruption was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The crowd roared as one, a thunderous wave of sound. Prince George and Crown Prince Constantine rushed from the royal box to run alongside Louis for the final lap, an utterly improvised and breathtaking breach of protocol. He crossed the finish line in 2 hours, 58 minutes and 50 seconds. Greece had its champion. The aftermath was pure, unadulterated national euphoria. Louis was carried on the shoulders of the crowd, hailed as a national hero. Offers of gifts poured in, free meals for life, free tailoring, even a marriage proposal from a wealthy admirer, which he politely declined, later marrying a woman he loved. The marathon had provided the perfect, mythic narrative. It connected the ancient legend to modern triumph, a humble everyman defeating the professionalized foreigners. For Greece, the success of the 1896 Games was vindication. For Coubertin and the IOC, it was a miraculous proof of concept. The Games had captured the public imagination. They had survived their first test. But the path forward was far from assured. The next celebration was already scheduled, in Coubertin's own Paris in 1900. If Athens was a focused, symbolic triumph, Paris would prove to be its chaotic, disorganized opposite. The 1900 Paris Olympics were, in many ways, a disaster for the Olympic movement. Coubertin, hoping to integrate the Games into the cultural fabric of a world capital, made a fatal concession. He allowed them to be swallowed whole by the gargantuan Paris Exposition Universelle, a world's fair meant to showcase the technological and cultural achievements of the new century. The Olympics became a mere sideshow, a program of athletic events scattered over 5 months with little coherence or identity. There was no opening or closing ceremony. Many competitors never knew they were participating in the Olympic Games. The events were listed as Championnats Internationaux of the Exposition. The organization was abysmal, with events held in inadequate venues, like the track and field competitions on the grass of the Racing Club de France, with trees inside the running track. The bizarre nature of these games reached its peak in the inclusion of what we would now call demonstration sports, or outright novelties, but which were awarded official Olympic status. There was pole climbing, where competitors shimmied up a greased pole for time. There was live pigeon shooting, a gruesome event where nearly 300 birds were killed, the winner being the one who shot down the most. There was firefighting, with competitions for firemen. There were ballooning, croquet, and a 200-meter swimming obstacle race where athletes had to climb over a pole and a row of boats. The chaos was total. Furthermore, the scheduling was so protracted and poorly publicized that spectators were sparse. The great American sprinter Alvin Cranesline won 4 gold medals in track and field, but he did so in front of handfuls of disinterested fairgoers. The Olympic ideal seemed drowned in the carnivalesque spectacle of the exposition. Yet, amidst this muddle, a quiet, historic breakthrough occurred, one almost lost to the chaos. For the first time, women competed in the Olympic Games. They were not welcomed by Coubertin, who held a Victorian view that women's role was to crown the male victors, not to compete. But the exposition's sporting program, being loosely organized, included women's events in golf and tennis. The first female Olympic champion was an American, Margaret Abbott. A 22-year-old art student living in Paris, she entered a 9-hole golf tournament at the Compiègne Club, likely attracted by the prospect of a beautiful porcelain bowl as a prize. She won with a score of 47. She was stylish, she was talented, and she had no idea she had just made history. Margaret Abbott returned to America, married, and lived her life never knowing she had become an Olympic champion. Her victory, and that of other female pioneers in tennis, was a footnote in the Parisian chaos, but it planted a seed that would, against Coubertin's wishes, grow into a fundamental pillar of the modern Olympic movement. If Paris was chaotic, the next iteration, the 1904 Games in St. Louis, Missouri, risked being immoral. Awarded to the United States, they were again tied to a World's Fair, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The journey to the American Midwest was long and expensive, drastically reducing international participation. Of the roughly 650 athletes, over 500 were American, making it effectively a national championship with a few guests. The events were spread out over 4.5 months. The organization was poor, with the marathon becoming a notorious fiasco. Run on dusty roads in brutal heat, it was won by Fred Laws, who famously rode in a car for 11 miles, then jogged into the stadium to claim victory before his deception was uncovered. The actual winner, Thomas Hicks, was administered strychnine and brandy by his trainers during the race, a dangerous performance aid that left him near death. But the most disturbing chapter of the 1904 Games was Anthropology Days. Organized by the fair's director of anthropological exhibits, William J.J. McGee, and endorsed by the Games organizer James Sullivan, this was a 2-day event where indigenous people from the fair's ethnic displays were recruited to compete in athletic contests. These individuals, Pygmies from Africa, Patagonians from South America, Native Americans and others, were forced to participate in events like mud fighting, spear throwing, and ethnic dancing, as well as standard Olympic events for which they had no training. The stated racist purpose was to demonstrate the natural athleticism or lack thereof among savage peoples compared to civilized white athletes. It was a grotesque spectacle of pseudo-scientific racism, a human zoo with medals. Coubertin, who did not attend, was later appalled, calling it a solemn and ridiculous mistake. Anthropology Days stands as a stark, dark reminder of how easily the Olympic platform could be perverted by the prevailing prejudices of the era, a far cry from the ideal of universal human excellence. After the debacles of Paris and St. Louis, the Olympic movement was at a crossroads. It had survived, but its credibility was fraying. It needed professionalism, standardization, and a return to solemn focus. The 1908 London Games, originally awarded to Rome but relocated after Mount Vesuvius erupted and strained Italy's finances, provided that crucial corrective. The British, with their love of rules and order, approached the task with meticulous efficiency. For the first time, a proper stadium was built specifically for the Games, the White City Stadium, a 68,000-seat marvel that housed the track, a swimming pool, and a cycling track. For the first time, a proper opening ceremony was staged, with teams marching behind their national flags. The British standardized events, schedules, and judging. They introduced the first purpose-built Olympic swimming pool. They created the first official Olympic guidebook. The modern Olympic template, as we would recognize it, was forged in London. The 1908 Games also crystallized the potent and often fraught relationship between Olympic sport and national identity. Tensions were high between the British organizers and the American team, fueled by disputes over judging and rules. The Americans accused the British of homerism. The British viewed the Americans as brash and disrespectful. This friction reached its dramatic peak in the marathon. The distance had been standardized for these games at 26 miles, 385 yards, the distance from Windsor Castle to the Royal Box at White City, so the royal children could see the start. On a brutally hot day, the Italian pastry chef Dorando Pietri entered the stadium first, but he was in a state of utter collapse. He fell, got up, and fell again, staggering in the wrong direction. British officials, moved by his plight, rushed to help him, supporting him, and turning him toward the finish line. He crossed it first, but the assistance rendered his victory invalid. The American Johnny Hayes, who entered the stadium second and finished unaided, was declared the winner. The drama, however, made Pietri an international hero. His gallant failure was seen as more noble than a straightforward victory. Queen Alexandra awarded him a special gilded cup in recognition of his effort. The incident highlighted the powerful narratives the Olympics could generate, the agony and ecstasy, the thin line between triumph and tragedy, and the role of the spectator in shaping the myth. London 1908 saved the Olympics from eccentric novelty, grounding them in administrative competence and dramatic storytelling. It proved the Games could be a major, well-run international spectacle. But it also revealed how easily they could become an arena for national rivalries, a theme that would only intensify in the decades to come. From the playing fields of rugby to the marble stadium of Athens, from the chaotic fairgrounds of Paris to the racist exhibitions of Saint Submissions of Saint Mail, Louis, and finally to the ordered arena of White City, the modern Olympic movement had navigated its tumultuous, eccentric revival. It had survived bankruptcy, absurdity, and ethical failure. It had discovered its most powerful narratives in the marathon and its necessary structure in British bureaucracy. Women had quietly entered the arena. The world had begun to pay attention. The dream of a French baron inspired by English schoolboys and Greek ghosts was no longer just an idea. It was a recurring event, a global expectation. But as the world stood on the brink of the 20th century's first great cataclysm, this fragile institution, now finding its feet, would face its ultimate test. The ideals of peace, understanding, and sporting fellowship were about to be confronted by the mechanized horror of total war. The flame, so carefully tended and shielded from the winds of chaos, would now have to survive a conflagration that consumed continents. This brings us to ideals tested by war. Politics enters the stadium. The Olympic Games were conceived as a sanctuary, a sacred truce, a gathering of youth from across the globe, competing not for nation, but for the pure, transcendent ideals of human excellence. It was a beautiful dream, born in the mind of a French aristocrat, Pierre de Coubertin. He believed sport could forge character, foster peace, and elevate mankind. For a few brief shining years at the dawn of the 20th century, that dream seemed not only possible, but palpable. The world was modernizing, connecting, and the Olympics were to be its joyous, rhythmic heartbeat. But the 20th century had other plans. It would become a century of unimaginable violence, of ideological fracture, of machines built not for speed but for slaughter. And the Olympic movement, that fragile vessel of idealism, would be swept up in the torrent. It would not remain a sanctuary for long. Instead, it would become a mirror, reflecting back at us our deepest prejudices, our most violent divisions, and our most profound hopes all at once. This is the story of the Olympics tested. When the gathering storm of global conflict began to darken the horizon, the Games did not stand apart. They were drawn into the maelstrom, forced to confront the very realities they were designed to transcend. This chapter is about that crucible. It begins at a moment of pure, unadulterated athletic glory, a zenith of the amateur ideal before the fall. It was the last Olympiad of innocence, though no one knew it at the time. All eyes were on Stockholm in the summer of 1912. The Stockholm Games were a masterpiece of organization, a model of efficiency that would set a new standard. For the first time, electronic timing devices were used, and a public address system echoed across the stadium. The sun shone on a peaceful, progressive Sweden, a neutral nation hosting a world that still believed in the steady march of civilization. And onto this stage walked a man who seemed a mythic figure, a primal force of nature sculpted into human form. His name was Jim Thorpe, a member of the Sac and Fox Nation, a student from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. He did not simply compete in Stockholm, he dominated the very essence of the Olympic ideal, the all-around athlete. He entered the pentathlon, a grueling test of 5 diverse skills, and won 4 at the 5 events, taking gold with ease. Then, just days later, he lined up for the decathlon, the ultimate trial of strength, speed, and endurance, 10 events over 2 brutal days. He won that too, and by a staggering margin. His point total would remain unbeaten for decades. At the medal ceremony, King Gustav V of Sweden presented the gold medals, grasped Thorpe's hand, and uttered the legendary words, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." Thorpe, the story goes, simply replied, "Thanks, King." It was the perfect moment. The ultimate amateur, from a marginalized community, triumphing through sheer, sublime talent. He returned to America a hero, paraded down Broadway with ticker tape raining from the skies. He was the embodiment of Coubertin's dream, the power of sport to elevate anyone from anywhere. But the dream was fragile, built on a foundation of strict, often hypocritical rules. The Olympic amateur code was sacrosanct. An athlete could not have ever received monetary compensation for sporting prowess, nor have competed professionally. It was a rule designed to protect the purity of the contest, to keep it a pursuit for gentlemen of leisure, or at least those who could afford to pretend to be. And Jim Thorpe, in his youth, had played semi-professional baseball for a few dollars a game during summer breaks. It was a common practice for college athletes, but it was a secret. A year after his triumphs, a newspaper reporter uncovered the old records. The Amateur Athletic Union, and later the International Olympic Committee, moved with swift, unforgiving severity. They demanded the return of his medals. Thorpe's confession was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I hope I will be partly excused by the fact that I was simply an Indian schoolboy and did not know all about such things." His plea fell on deaf ears. He was disqualified, stripped of his titles, and his records were erased from the official books. The greatest athlete in the world was cast out, not for doping, not for cheating on the field, but for a technical violation of an elitist code. The racism of the era was an unspoken accomplice. Would a white athlete of similar stature have been pursued with such relentless zeal? The question hangs heavily over the decision. The Stockholm zenith, so bright and promising, was suddenly shadowed by a profound injustice. The Olympics had shown it could create gods, and with equal ease it could tear them down. The ideal of pure amateurism was revealed not as a noble pursuit, but as a weapon of control, often wielded against those who did not belong to the traditional corridors of power. Thorpe's medals were given to the runners-up, who reportedly refused to accept them, knowing they were not the rightful owners. The trophies were placed in a museum, and Jim Thorpe would die in poverty decades later, still asking for their return. The Stockholm Games, for all their glory, ended with a stain. And as the world moved on from 1912, the stain of something far greater was spreading across Europe. The Olympic dream was about to face a far more direct and devastating threat than internal hypocrisy. It was about to confront the mechanized horror of total war. The next Olympiad was scheduled for 1916. The proud host city was to be Berlin, Germany. The German Olympic Committee, infused with national pride and a desire to showcase their nation's organizational prowess and growing power, embarked on an ambitious project. They commissioned the construction of a monumental stadium, the Deutsches Stadion, a colossal concrete and stone arena designed to hold over 30,000 spectators. It was a temple to sport, a physical manifestation of the Olympic spirit's forward march. Ground was broken, the structure rose, and by 1913 it was complete, awaiting the world's athletes. But even as the stadium was being finished, the drums of war were beginning to beat. Nationalist tensions, imperial rivalries, and complex alliances were pulling the continent apart. When the summer of 1914 arrived, the Olympic preparations were in full swing. But in late June, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set in motion a chain of events that would obliterate the old world. By August, Europe was engulfed in flame. The Great War had begun. The magnificent Deutsches Stadion, built for the celebration of human peace and potential, was never used for its intended purpose. Instead, it was repurposed as a military hospital. Its vast infield and concourses, meant for sprinters and spectators, now held rows of beds for the wounded and the dying. The Olympic ideal of a sacred truce was rendered utterly meaningless by the scale of the conflict. For 4 years, the world was consumed by trench warfare, poison gas, and unprecedented slaughter. An entire generation of young men, the very demographic from which Olympic athletes were drawn, was decimated on the fields of Flanders, Verdun, and the Somme. Many past and future Olympians traded their singlet for a uniform, and many never returned. The war was a direct existential challenge to Coubertin's philosophy. How could one believe in the unifying power of sport when nations were engaged in such industrialized butchery? Coubertin himself, a French patriot, saw his life's work seemingly shattered. In a poignant and controversial decision, he moved the IOC headquarters to neutral Switzerland for the duration, and he is said to have enlisted in the French army, though his service was brief. The war did not just interrupt the Olympic cycle, it mocked its very premise. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world was shattered. Maps were redrawn, empires had crumbled, and a deep, traumatizing grief had settled over the victors and vanquished alike. The question was not just whether the Olympics could continue, but whether they should. Was it appropriate to hold a festival of sport amid such overwhelming mourning? Coubertin, ever the stubborn idealist, believed it was more necessary than ever. The Games, he argued, must go on. They must be a symbol of recovery, of life stubbornly reasserting itself. And so, with a scarred world still nursing its wounds, the Olympic movement gathered itself for its next act. The chosen city was Antwerp, in Belgium, a nation that had suffered horrific devastation and occupation during the war. It was a deliberate, symbolic choice to bring the light of the Games to one of the war's darkest places. The 1920 Antwerp Games were, inevitably, the Games of mourning. They were organized in haste, with limited resources, by a nation still in ruins. The stadium was rudimentary, the athletes' accommodations were spartan, and a pall of recent loss hung over everything. The opening ceremony was a somber affair. For the first time, the Olympic flag was raised, the 5 interlocking rings conceived by Coubertin, symbolizing the unity of the 5 inhabited continents. And for the first time, an athlete took the Olympic oath, swearing to compete with honor and respect for the rules. These new traditions were direct responses to the war, attempts to institutionalize the ideals of peace and fair play that had so recently been absent. But the wounds of the conflict were too fresh for true unity. In a move of stark political exclusion, the defeated nations, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire were not invited. The Soviet Union, now a communist state, also chose not to participate. The Olympics, meant to transcend politics, were now explicitly political. They were a celebration for the victors only. The spirit of reconciliation was still years away. The competition itself was marked by this somber, raw atmosphere. The athletes were older. Many were soldiers who had survived the trenches. Their bodies bore the scars, and their minds carried the memories. Yet, within this context, moments of pure athletic beauty shone through with even greater intensity. Paavo Nurmi of Finland, the Flying Finn, made his Olympic debut, winning 3 gold medals in long-distance running, his stoic, machine-like pace, a new phenomenon in the sport. He ran not with joy, but with a fierce, almost grim determination, a reflection of his nation's recent struggle for independence. For women, the Games were a small, tentative step forward. They had been competing in tennis, swimming, and figure skating since 1900, but in Antwerp they were included in swimming and diving events more formally, though their participation remained limited and heavily debated. The most poignant symbol of Antwerp was the release of doves at the opening ceremony, a new tradition representing peace. The birds circled the stadium, a fragile living symbol of hope over a field where, just years before, hope had been in such short supply. The Antwerp Games were not a joyous festival. They were a difficult, painful, but necessary step. They proved the Olympics could survive a cataclysm. They had been bent by the war, infused with its grief and its divisions, but they had not broken. The movement was wounded, but it was alive. And as the 1920s progressed, a decade of economic boom, cultural frenzy, and simmering geopolitical tensions, the Olympics sought to reclaim their celebratory spirit. The next host would be Paris in 1924, the city of Coubertin's birth. It would be his farewell as president, and he wanted a grand spectacle. But the story of those Paris Games would be defined not by pageantry, but by the profound personal convictions of 2 very different men, whose journeys would later become the stuff of Hollywood legend, yet whose real stories cut even deeper into the heart of the Olympic ideal. The 1924 Paris Games are forever linked to the film Chariots of Fire, and for good reason. The story of Harold Abrahams, the Cambridge-educated son of a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant, and Eric Liddell, the devout Scottish missionary, is a narrative of faith, identity, and principle that resonates across a century. But the true history is even more compelling than the cinematic poetry. Harold Abrahams was a complex, driven man. He was acutely aware of the subtle and not-so-subtle anti-Semitism within the British athletic establishment and the halls of Cambridge. Running, for him, was a weapon against prejudice. "I'm going to take them on," he said, "and I'm going to beat them." He was a fierce, analytical competitor, the first British sprinter to employ a professional coach, a move that raised eyebrows among the amateur purists. His victory in the 100 meters was not just a personal triumph, it was a social statement, a breaking of a barrier. He stood on the podium as a proud Englishman and a proud Jew, a dual identity he carried in a time of rising nationalism. Then there was Eric Liddell, the Flying Scotsman. His refusal to run in the 100-meter heats on a Sunday, because of his strict observance of the Christian Sabbath, is the famous climax. But the reality was more nuanced. Liddell had known the schedule for months. His decision was not a last-minute drama. He had trained instead for the 400 meters, an event he considered not his best. What happened on that track, on a weekday, was one of the most extraordinary displays of grace under pressure in Olympic history. As Liddell went to the starting line for the 400-meter final, an American masseur slipped a piece of paper into his hand. It contained a verse from the Bible, "He that honors me, I will honor." He led from start to finish, setting a new world record. It was a victory of spirit as much as speed. Liddell's faith was not a hindrance, it was the source of his power. Abrahams and Liddell represented two powerful responses to the pressure of the Olympic stage, one using sport to claim a place in a world that was skeptical of him, the other using sport as an expression of a faith that transcended it. They were both amateurs in the truest, most noble sense. They competed for something greater than money or fame. Their stories were embraced by the public, a welcome narrative of individual conscience and triumph after the collective trauma of war. But the Paris Games also had a darker, more brutal side. They were the last Olympics to feature tennis until its return decades later, and they were the first to introduce the phrase Olympic Village, though it was just a collection of basic cabins for male athletes. The heat that summer was oppressive, and the swimming events were held in the murky, tidal waters of the Seine, to the discomfort of many competitors. And in the shadow of Abrahams and Liddell's glory, another story unfolded, one that spoke to the lingering colonial mindset. The Paris Games are often remembered for the success of the Finnish team, led by Paavo Nurmi, who won 5 gold medals with his iconic stopwatch-clutching efficiency. But also competing were athletes from colonized nations, wearing the vests of their imperial masters. The complexities of identity and nationhood were becoming ever more present on the Olympic stage. Paris 1924 was a games of profound contrasts, faith versus ambition, individual glory versus national pride, the lingering past versus a modernizing future. It showed that the Olympics could be a canvas for the most profound human stories. And as the world accelerated into the late 1920s, a decade of flappers, jazz, and social upheaval, the Games would be forced to confront one of the most fundamental questions of all: who, exactly, was allowed to be an Olympian? The battle for the inclusion of women was about to reach its climax. The 1928 Amsterdam Olympics are often called the first modern Games. They introduced now iconic elements. The Parade of Nations began with Greece and ended with the host country, a tradition that continues. The Olympic flame was lit for the duration, though the torch relay was still a Berlin 1936 innovation, and the events were more standardized. But the most significant, and most controversial, modernization occurred on the track. For the first time, women were allowed to compete in standard athletics events: the 100 meters, the 800 meters, the 4x100 meter relay, the high jump, and the discus. This was not a gift granted willingly by the all-male International Olympic Committee. It was the result of years of relentless pressure, organization, and competition by women athletes themselves. The driving force was Alice Milliet, a French sportswoman who, frustrated by the IOC's refusal to include women's track and field, founded the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale in 1921. She organized the first Women's World Games in Paris in 1922, a huge success that drew large crowds and proved there was both talent and public appetite for women's athletics. Faced with this rival popular movement, the IOC reluctantly agreed to include a limited program of 5 events in Amsterdam, partly to co-opt and control the narrative. The inclusion was met with fierce resistance from traditionalists, including Pierre de Coubertin himself, who remained a staunch opponent of women's Olympic competition until his death. The medical establishment of the time often bizarrely claimed that strenuous athletic activity could damage women's reproductive health. The controversy came to a head in the 800-meter race. It was a fiercely competitive final. The winner, Lena Radke of Germany, set a new world record. Several runners, pushing their bodies to a limit they had rarely been allowed to test in international competition, collapsed from exhaustion after crossing the finish line. This physical distress was immediately seized upon by critics. The sight of women in such a state was deemed unladylike and dangerous. The reporting was sensationalized and condescending. As a direct result, the IOC banned women from running any race longer than 200 meters for the next 32 years. The 800 meters would not return until 1960. It was a devastating setback, a stark reminder that progress was fragile and could be rolled back by prejudice. Yet, despite the controversy, the door had been cracked open. Women like Betty Robinson of the United States, who at just 16 years old won the first ever women's 100-meter Olympic gold, became pioneers. Robinson's story itself is remarkable. A few years after her triumph, she was severely injured in a plane crash, told she would never walk again, yet she returned to win another gold in the relay in 1936. The women of Amsterdam competed under a microscope of scrutiny and judgment, but they competed. They proved their prowess, their strength, and their right to be on that stage. Their struggle highlighted a central tension in the Olympic ideal, the promise of universal participation versus the deeply ingrained social biases of the era. The Games were a global platform, and now that platform was being contested. Amsterdam also saw the emergence of other icons. It was the Games of Paavo Nurmi's final individual gold, and of Johnny Weissmuller's dominance in the pool before he became Hollywood's Tarzan. But the legacy of 1928 is indelibly tied to those women on the cinder track, running not just for medals, but for the very future of their sport. They faced a finish line of opportunity, only to have it pushed back. Yet, they had broken the plane. The world was changing, lurching from the roaring 20s towards economic collapse. And as the global depression of the 1930s engulfed nations, the next Olympic host faced a daunting task: to stage a celebration of human achievement at a time of profound human despair. That host was Los Angeles in 1932. The Great Depression cast a long, dark shadow across the world. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and breadlines became a common sight in cities from Berlin to New York. In this climate of fear and scarcity, the idea of spending millions on a sporting festival seemed, to many, frivolous at best, obscene at worst. Los Angeles, a city growing into its own mythos of sunshine and opportunity, had won the bid in a more optimistic time. Now they had to deliver. The result was nothing short of a miracle of planning and pragmatism. The Los Angeles Coliseum, originally built in the 1920s, was expanded to hold over 100,000 spectators, becoming the first true Olympic megastadium. For the first time, a proper, purpose-built Olympic village was constructed. Though, notably, it was for male athletes only, women were housed in a hotel. The village in the Baldwin Hills had hundreds of cottages, post offices, hospitals, and libraries, creating a self-contained world for the athletes. It was a model of efficiency that would set the standard for all future games. But the most striking feature of the 1932 Games was their scale in a time of shrinkage. With global travel expensive and nations struggling financially, participation dropped dramatically. Only about half the number of athletes from the 1928 Games came to Los Angeles. The crowds, however, were massive. Southern Californians, perhaps seeking escape from the grim realities of the Depression, flocked to the events. They were treated to a spectacle of unprecedented smoothness. These were the first Games to use photo finish cameras, and the first to have victory ceremonies with the medalists standing on a tiered podium while their national flags were raised. A now universal tradition born in L. A. The stopwatch precision of the organization mirrored the athletic performances. It was here that the modern concept of the Olympic star was fully born, thanks in large part to one young woman, Mildred "Babe" Didrikson. Babe was a force of nature. She entered 3 events, the javelin, the 80-meter hurdles, and the high jump. She won gold in the javelin with a world record throw. She won gold in the hurdles, setting another world record. and in the high jump she tied for first, but was awarded the silver due to a controversial ruling about her jumping style. She was, without question, the standout athlete of the Games, a multi-sport phenomenon whose talent and brash personality captivated the press and public. She represented a new kind of athlete, fiercely competitive, supremely confident, and a master of publicity. The Los Angeles Games also saw the continued rise of Japanese swimming, signaling the growing athletic prowess of non-Western nations. Yet, for all its organizational brilliance and star power, the 1932 Olympics were haunted by the context in which they occurred. The glitz of Los Angeles, the perfect weather, the streamlined events, felt for some like a beautiful distraction, a fantasy land insulated from the suffering beyond the stadium walls. But perhaps that was its greatest achievement. In the depths of the Depression, the Los Angeles Games provided a vision of order, excellence, and hope. They demonstrated that human organization could still create something magnificent. They offered a 2-week narrative where the stakes were clear, the rules were fair, and the best person won. A stark contrast to the chaotic, unfair economic realities outside the gates. They were a testament to resilience. The model they created, the commercial sponsorship, the focus on the athlete experience, the media spectacle, would define the Olympic future. But that future was already under a new and ominous shadow. Even as the athletes departed Los Angeles, a political movement was gaining terrifying momentum in Germany. It was a movement that saw in the Olympic model not a celebration of human unity, but a powerful tool for propaganda. The next Games were scheduled for Berlin in 1936. The stadium built for war, and never used, was about to get its chance to host the world. But the ideals of the Olympics would face their most severe test yet, not from global conflict this time, but from a regime intent on weaponizing the Games for its own sinister purposes. The journey from the sun-drenched ideals of Stockholm to the efficient spectacle of Los Angeles was a passage through the fire of the 20th century's early decades. The Olympics had been scarred by racism, shattered by World War, infused with mourning, inspired by faith, challenged by the fight for inclusion, and tempered by economic collapse. At each turn, the movement had adapted, survived, and even grown. It had proven itself to be not a fragile dream, but a resilient institution. But its core ideals, peace, unity, fair play, the elevation of the individual over the nation, had been strained, bent, and often compromised. The Games had held up a mirror to the world's progress and its prejudices. As the 1930s deepened, a new and far more deliberate threat emerged. The next host nation was not interested in simply testing the Olympic ideals. It aimed to subvert them entirely, to twist the language of sport into a dialect of hate and supremacy. The stadium in Berlin, once a hospital for the wounded of a war meant to end all wars, was being readied for a different kind of battle, a battle for the soul of the Olympic movement itself. The sanctuary was about to become a stage for the darkest of political theatre. This brings us to Weaponized Games. Weaponized Games, the Olympic Games. The very phrase conjures images of soaring human achievement, of unity forged in peaceful competition. A sacred flame passed from one nation to the next, a symbol of hope that transcends borders and politics. It is a story we love to tell ourselves. But from its very inception in ancient Greece, the Games were never just sport. They were a testament to civic pride, to military readiness, to ideological supremacy. The modern revival in 1896, spearheaded by the idealistic Baron Pierre de Coubertin, was born from this same potent mix. Coubertin dreamed of a festival that would promote international understanding and the cultivation of both body and spirit. He spoke of the moral qualities of athletics and the pursuit of peace. It was a noble, beautiful vision. But in the turbulent 20th century, that vision would be tested, twisted, and weaponized like never before. The stadium would become a stage not just for athletes, but for nations, for ideologies, for the most brutal and profound conflicts of the modern age. The Parade of Nations became a geopolitical map, the medal count, a scorecard for competing systems. This is the story of how the Olympics, designed as a sanctuary from the world's strife, became one of its most powerful and contested battlegrounds. It is a story that begins not with a starting pistol, but with a chilling, meticulously orchestrated lie in the heart of a regime built on hate. Our journey into the weaponization of the Games opens in 1936, in a Berlin gripped by a feverish transformation. 3 years earlier, the International Olympic Committee had awarded the Games to the Weimar Republic, a gesture of reconciliation to a Germany still scarred by the First World War. But by 1936, the Weimar Republic was gone, replaced by Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Initially, Hitler was dismissive of the Olympics, seeing them as a degenerate spectacle. But his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, recognized their potential instantly. Here was a global audience, a chance to present the new Germany not as a belligerent, racist police state, but as a peaceful, prosperous, and powerful nation. The Olympics would be the ultimate public relations coup. The regime poured staggering resources into the event. A colossal new sports complex was built in Berlin, crowned by the 100,000-seat Olympiastadion, a monument of cold, imposing neoclassicism. The city was scrubbed clean, anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed. A massive security operation masked the brutal reality of the concentration camps already operating at Dachau and elsewhere. The world was invited to a meticulously staged performance, and the International Olympic Committee. They chose to be a willing audience. Despite mounting evidence of the Nazi persecution of Jewish and Romani people, and in direct violation of the Olympic Charter's principles of non-discrimination, the IOC under President Count Henri de Baillet, Latour opted for what they called quiet diplomacy. They accepted hollow assurances from the Germans that Jewish athletes would be allowed to try out for the team. The reality was a cruel sham. Germany's few elite Jewish athletes were systematically excluded, harassed, and forced into exile. The only partial exception was the fencer Helene Mayer, who had a Jewish father. She was included on the team as a token gesture to appease international critics. The IOC, desperate to preserve the Games and perhaps swayed by the impressive facade, looked the other way. They validated the regime with their presence. The world's press arrived in droves, many of them taken on carefully curated tours that reinforced the image of a vibrant, happy Germany. For 2 weeks in August, the Nazi dictatorship enjoyed a legitimacy on the world stage it had never possessed before. It was a masterclass in deception, and the opening ceremony was its crescendo. The spectacle was overwhelming. Thousands of performers, precise military-like choreography, and the haunting, monolithic beauty of the stadium itself. When Hitler arrived to declare the Games open, the crowd's roar was deafening. The Parade of Nations saw teams giving the Nazi salute as they passed the Führer's box. The Americans offered only a respectful dip of their flag, a small but noted act of defiance. Then came the most potent new symbol, the Olympic torch relay. Conceived by the Nazis and embraced by the IOC, it was a brilliant piece of political theatre. The idea of a flame carried from ancient Olympia to the modern host city created a tangible, poetic link to the past. But in 1936, the route was carefully plotted through southeastern Europe, regions of historical German interest, symbolically uniting the Aryan ideal with the cradle of Western civilization. The flame served the Nazi myth of a purified, connected Germanic destiny. It was a breathtaking innovation that permanently altered the Olympic pageant, a gift from a propaganda machine to the world, its dark origins often forgotten in its subsequent beauty. The stage was set, the world was watching. And into this arena, built to glorify Aryan supremacy, stepped a man who would, through sheer athletic genius, dismantle its core myth in front of the entire planet. His name was Jesse Owens, a 22-year-old son of Alabama sharecroppers, a student at Ohio State University. In the span of 45 minutes on a single afternoon, Owens won the 100-meter dash, shattering Olympic records. He would go on to win 4 gold medals in total: the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 meter relay. Each victory was a direct, undeniable refutation of the Nazi doctrine of Aryan racial superiority. The German crowds, conditioned to see black athletes as inferior, were initially cool. But Owens's grace, his humility, and his transcendent talent won them over. They cheered him thunderously. The story often told is that Hitler, enraged, refused to shake Owens's hand, snubbing him in a fit of pique. The truth is more nuanced, and in its way, more revealing. On the first day, Hitler had congratulated only German winners. The IOC, concerned about protocol, informed him he must congratulate all winners or none. He chose none, thereby avoiding the political disaster of publicly shaking hands with a black man. The snub was institutional, not merely personal. But the myth of the direct insult took hold, cementing Owens as the symbolic vanquisher of Nazi ideology. Yet within this stark narrative of racial confrontation lies a quieter, more human story that complicates the political drama. It is the story of Owens and his rival, the German long jumper Karl Ludwig Losers Long. Long was the archetypal Aryan athlete, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, a law student from Leipzig. He was the embodiment of everything the Nazis wanted to showcase. In the long jump qualifying round, Owens was perilously close to elimination, fouling on his first 2 attempts. A third foul would mean he was out. It was then that Long, his chief competitor, walked over. He suggested Owens make a mark well short of the takeoff board and jump from there, just to ensure a safe qualifying jump. Owens took the advice, qualified easily, and went on to defeat Long in the finals, setting a new Olympic record. After Owens's final, winning jump, the first person to congratulate him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, was Lose Long. They walked arm in arm toward the stands, talking and smiling. In that gesture, Long defied the ideology of his own state. He prioritized the Olympic spirit of fellowship and fair play above nationalistic fervor. The 2 men corresponded as pen pals until Long's death in 1943, fighting for Germany and Sicily. For Owens, the friendship was a lifelong touchstone. "It took a lot of courage for him to befriend me in front of Hitler," Owens later said. "You can melt down all the medals and cups I have, and there wouldn't be a plating on the 24-carat friendship I felt for Lose Long." This moment, often highlighted as a beacon of hope, is also profoundly tragic. It reveals the individual humanity that persists within the machine of state propaganda, a humanity that the system would ultimately consume. Long's act was beautiful, but it was an exception, not a rule. The machinery of the Nazi spectacle was far larger, and its artistic architect was already at work, crafting the regime's most enduring visual legacy from the Olympic raw footage. That architect was Leni Riefenstahl. A filmmaker of undeniable genius and relentless ambition, Riefenstahl was given unprecedented resources by Hitler to create a documentary of the Berlin Games. The result was Olympia, a 2-part film that remains one of the most influential and controversial works in cinema history. Riefenstahl and her crew used techniques that were revolutionary: cameras on rails, in pits, on balloons, on floating rafts in the swimming pool. She filmed athletes with a sensual, almost worshipful aesthetic, their bodies glistening, muscles straining in slow motion, transforming them into modern-day gods. The opening sequence is a masterpiece of myth-making, a fog-shrouded ode to classical Greece that directly links the Nazi present to an idealized Aryan past. The film's power is seductive. It aestheticizes the human form and the athletic struggle to a sublime degree. But it is impossible to separate this artistry from its purpose. Olympia is not a documentary in a neutral sense. It is a hymn to the Nazi ideal of physical perfection and power. It deliberately downplays the victories of non-Aryans like Jesse Owens, focusing instead on German triumphs and the overwhelming beautiful spectacle of the games themselves. It presents the Berlin that Hitler wanted the world to see, orderly, powerful, and culturally ascendant. Riefenstahl always claimed she was simply an artist capturing beauty, but her film was funded by the state, created at the behest of its dictator and served as its most sophisticated piece of international propaganda. Olympia represents the ultimate weaponization of the Olympic image, where the very memory of the event is filtered through the lens of the regime, its artistry making the politics palatable, even glorious, for generations of viewers who might forget the context. While the story of Jesse Owens rightly dominates the memory of Berlin 1936, other athletes carried different, equally potent political burdens. On the podium for the marathon stood a man in deep anguish. His name was Son Ki-chung, and he had just won the gold medal. But as the Japanese national anthem played and the rising sun flag was raised, Son stood with his head bowed, his eyes closed. A defiant oak sapling had been placed on the podium's victor's stand, obscuring the flag on his uniform. Son Ki-chung was Korean, and his nation had been under brutal Japanese colonial rule since 1910. He was forced to compete for the Empire of Japan under the Japanese name Son Kite. His victory was a moment of profound national pride for Koreans and profound personal torment for him. In a secret meeting with Korean reporters before the Games, he had signed his name in Korean in a book, writing next to it a statement of solidarity with his oppressed people. On the podium, his bowed head was a silent, powerful protest against erasure. The Japanese officials claimed it was a sign of respect. Every Korean knew it was an act of resistance. Back in Korea, newspapers celebrated his victory but were forced by censors to blot out the image of the Japanese flag on his chest, creating iconic, obscured photographs of a champion whose identity had been politically erased. Son's story is a stark reminder that the athlete's body is often a contested site, a vessel for national identities that are imposed, not chosen. His gold medal was a victory for Korea, but it was recorded in the Olympic ledger as a victory for Japan, a cruel twist that encapsulates the colonial experience. He returned not to a hero's welcome in an independent nation, but to continued subjugation. His silent protest on the podium was a weapon of the powerless, a political statement carved from the agony of personal triumph. The Berlin Games were a stunning success for the Nazi regime, a propaganda triumph that bought it goodwill and time, but the peace it feigned was a brittle illusion. Within 3 years, Hitler's armies marched into Poland, and the world was plunged into war. The Olympic flame, so brilliantly exploited in 1936, was extinguished. The Games of 1940, awarded to Tokyo, and 1944, scheduled for London, were cancelled. It was a stark admission that the Olympic ideal could not exist amidst total global conflict. The stadiums built for peace became factories for war. The 1940 Tokyo Games were particularly symbolic. They were intended to showcase Japan's emergence as a modern world power, just as Berlin had for Germany. But Japan's escalating militarism and invasion of China made the Games untenable. The IOC moved them briefly to Helsinki before cancelling them altogether. The cancelled Games stand as ghostly markers in Olympic history, stark proof that when politics fail utterly, the festival of sport is the first thing to fall. When the flame was finally relit, it was in a world utterly transformed by devastation. The year was 1948. The host city was London, a capital still scarred by bomb sites and gripped by severe rationing. These were the austerity games. No new venues were built. Athletes were housed in military barracks and college dormitories. They brought their own food, donated from care packages around the world. The Olympic Village was a testament to making do, and in a decision heavy with the recent pain of war, the defeated Axis powers, Germany and Japan, were not invited. The Soviet Union was invited but chose not to attend. These were games for the victors and the neutral, a somber, pared-back affair focused on the simple act of coming together again. The grand spectacle of Berlin was a distant, discredited memory. Here, the Olympics served a new purpose, not as a showcase for power, but as a therapy for recovery. The opening ceremony was held in Wembley Stadium on a grey July day. There was no lavish display, just the joy of competition returning. A new hero emerged, Fanny Blankers. Cohen, a 30-year-old Dutch mother of 2, who won 4 gold medals in track and field, challenging notions of age and gender, and becoming a symbol of hope and resilience for a rebuilding Europe. The 1948 Games were a conscious return to modesty, an attempt to reclaim the Olympic spirit from the grandiose political weapon it had become. They were a necessary reset, a humble gathering in the rubble, but the world's political landscape was already shifting into a new, bipolar configuration. The quiet of London was merely the calm before a different kind of storm. That storm broke in Helsinki in 1952. For the first time, the Soviet Union participated in the Olympic Games. The Cold War had arrived in the stadium, and the Olympics would never be the same. The Soviets did not approach the Games as mere sport. They saw them as a critical front in the ideological battle against the capitalist West, a proving ground for the superiority of the communist system. Rejecting the amateur ideal as a bourgeois hypocrisy, they created a vast, state-sponsored athletic machine. Their athletes were effectively professionals, trained full-time, their lives dedicated to sporting victory as a matter of state policy. The Soviet presence changed everything. The medal count became a direct proxy for the success of communism versus capitalism. Every race, every match, was freighted with geopolitical significance. The opening ceremony in Helsinki was charged with tension. The Soviet team, marching under a new flag and anthem, refused to stay in the Olympic Village with capitalist athletes, housing their team instead on a Soviet ship docked in the harbour. When the competition began, the rivalry was immediate and intense. The focus was on the battle between the two new superpowers, the United States and the USSR. The drama crystallized in the athletic duel between two men who would become archetypes of the Cold War, the American pole vaulter, Bob Richards, a charismatic preacher known as the vaulting vicar, and the Soviet vaulter, a soldier who embodied the disciplined, state-made athlete. But beyond individual rivalries, the Soviet system announced its arrival with shocking force, particularly in gymnastics and weightlifting. Their athletes, products of relentless scientific training, dominated. The message was clear: the collective might of the socialist system could produce superior physical specimens. The Helsinki Games also saw the return of Germany, not as a single team, but as a divided nation. A unified German team was proposed but failed. Instead, athletes from West Germany competed under the German flag, while East Germany was subsumed within the Soviet bloc. The partition of Europe was now mirrored in the Olympic roster. The 1952 Games institutionalized the Olympics as a central theater of the Cold War. The bipolar world order meant that for the next 4 decades, every Olympiad would be a meticulously scored battle for global prestige. The stadium became an ideological chessboard, the athletes its most powerful pieces. The spirit of Coubertin seemed a distant memory, replaced by the relentless logic of superpower confrontation. The Games were now permanently weaponized, not by a single rogue regime, but by the fundamental divide of the age. The Helsinki model set the template. The Olympics were now a high-stakes political game, and the world watched as the United States and the Soviet Union turned athletic performance into a metric of national vitality. This state of affairs would define the next generation of games, creating moments of both breathtaking achievement and profound political peril. But the weaponization of the Olympics was not a one-way street. If states could use athletes as political symbols, the athletes themselves could begin to reclaim that power. The stadium, for all its control, offered a global platform like no other. And in the decades that followed, as social movements shook the foundations of societies in the West and dissent simmered in the East, individual athletes and groups would discover the potent force of a protest staged at the very heart of the spectacle. The political machinery that sought to use them could, in a flash of courage, be turned against itself. The silent, bowed head of Son Ki-chung in 1936 was a precursor. The coming era would see that silent protest erupt into a defiant, global statement. This brings us to revolution and protest. Revolution and protest. In the collective imagination, the Olympic Games are a pristine tableau. A grand, quadrennial festival of human potential, where the world sets aside its differences and gathers in peace to celebrate the purest ideals of sport. The 5 interlocking rings symbolize the union of the 5 continents, a vision of global harmony conceived by Baron Pierre de Coubertin in the twilight of the 19th century. It is a powerful, enduring myth. But the history of the modern Olympics tells a different, far more complex story. From its very inception, the Games have been a mirror, reflecting not just athletic excellence, but the seismic political, social, and ideological fractures of their time. They have been a stage, not merely for sport, but for revolution and protest, for acts of breathtaking defiance and profound tragedy. The arena has never been an escape from the world. It is the world, condensed, amplified, and broadcast to billions. This is the story of the Olympics not as a sanctuary from conflict, but as its crucible. A narrative where the starting pistol echoes like a gunshot, where a victory stand can become a platform for a movement, and where the pursuit of gold is often overshadowed by the weight of history. We begin our journey in 1960, in the ancient heart of the Roman Empire, where a lone runner from a conquered nation would write a new chapter in the story of liberation, with nothing but his own 2 feet. The 1960 Rome Olympics were billed as the Games of Renewal, a celebration of post-war Europe's recovery and a deliberate linking of the modern spectacle to the classical past. Events were held in the shadows of the Caracalla Baths and the Basilica of Maxentius. It was a carefully crafted pageant of continuity. But on the final day of competition, a quiet, unassuming soldier from Ethiopia shattered that curated narrative and delivered a message of stunning clarity. His name was Abebe Bikila. He was 28 years old, a member of the imperial bodyguard of Emperor Haile Selassie, and he chose to run the marathon barefoot. The image was jarring, primal. While his competitors wore modern running shoes, Bikila's feet, hardened by a childhood running across the highlands of East Africa, struck the Roman cobblestones. The marathon route was itself a historical tour, passing under the Arch of Constantine, winding past the Roman Forum, and finishing at night, under the illumination of Roman soldiers holding torches at the Arch of Constantine. As the race progressed, Bikila and his training partner, Abebe Wagira, detached themselves from the pack. Then, near the obelisk of Axum, a monument plundered by Italian forces during Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, Bikila made his decisive move. He surged ahead, leaving even Wagira behind. The symbolism was almost too potent to be accidental. Here was a man from Ethiopia, a nation that had been brutally invaded by fascist Italy, running barefoot past a stolen national treasure, toward the finish line in the capital of the very empire that had colonized his continent. When Abebe Bikila entered the floodlit Piazza di Porta Capena, he was alone. He crossed the finish line, not with a look of exhausted relief, but with a series of vigorous calisthenics, demonstrating a reserve of power that left the world awestruck. He had not only won, he had set a new world record. When asked why he ran barefoot, he simply replied, "I wanted the world to know that my country, Ethiopia, has always won with determination and heroism." This was not just a personal victory, it was a national catharsis. Ethiopia, one of only 2 African nations to avoid formal colonization, had been violently subjugated by Italy from 1935 to 1941. Bikila's triumph was a visceral reclaiming of dignity. More broadly, it was a signal flare for the entire African continent. The year 1960 was the year of Africa, when 17 nations shook off the chains of colonialism and gained independence. Bikila, in his silent, powerful grace, became the embodiment of this new dawn. He was the first black African to win an Olympic gold medal. His victory announced Africa's arrival on the world stage, not as a subject, but as a sovereign force. The barefoot runner on the Roman cobblestones was a repudiation of a centuries-old order. He proved that excellence could emerge from anywhere, that the tools of the conqueror fancy shoes, advanced technology, were no match for the determined human spirit. His win was a revolution in motion, a decolonization of the sporting narrative itself. It paved the way for the dominance of East African distance running, transforming the athletic landscape forever. But it also set a precedent. the Olympics as a platform for national identity and political statement. 4 years later, the Games would travel to a nation itself reborn from the ashes of war, eager to use the Olympic stage to reconstruct its global image. Tokyo in 1964 was a city and a nation utterly transformed. Less than 2 decades had passed since the firebombings, and the atomic obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had left Japan shattered, occupied, and morally devastated. The 1964 Olympics were conceived as the ultimate symbol of Japan's phoenix-like resurrection. It was a meticulously planned, exorbitantly expensive declaration that Japan was no longer a militaristic empire, but a peaceful, technologically advanced economic powerhouse. The government poured billions into infrastructure. The iconic Shinkansen bullet train, which connected Tokyo and Osaka just in time for the Games, became a gleaming symbol of speed and efficiency. New highways, hotels, and the stunning Yoyogi National Gymnasium, with its sweeping suspension roof designed by Kenzo Tange, showcased a bold, modernist future. Every detail was choreographed to project harmony, order, and innovation. These were the first Games to be held in Asia, a deliberate passing of the torch to a new region. And they were the first to be broadcast via satellite to a global audience in near real time. The Syncom 3 satellite beamed images across the Pacific to the United States, and from there to Europe. For the first time, the Olympics became a truly global, simultaneous event. The world watched as Japan presented its new face, orderly, polite, and futuristic. The opening ceremony was a masterpiece of symbolism. The final torchbearer was Yoshinori Sakai, a 19-year-old born in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the day the atomic bomb fell. Dubbed the Atomic Baby, his run was a poignant, powerful statement of life emerging from destruction, of peace chosen over war. The Tokyo Games were a technical and aesthetic triumph. They introduced the use of computers for timing and statistics, and the photo finish camera. The sport of judo was included for the first time, a respectful nod to Japanese tradition. Yet, even in this tightly controlled environment, politics simmered beneath the surface. Indonesia and North Korea were banned for having defied the IOC's rules on amateurism by holding their own sports competition, the Games of the New Emerging Forces. More subtly, the shadow of the Cold War loomed. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in their usual medal table battle. But the most enduring athletic story, beyond Japan's impressive haul of gold medals, was one that echoed Bikila's. Abebe Bikila returned to defend his marathon title. This time, he wore shoes. And just 6 weeks after having his appendix removed, he dominated the race again, shattering his own world record by over 3 minutes. His back-to-back marathon victories remain one of the most superhuman feats in Olympic history. But Tokyo's primary legacy was its presentation. It proved the Olympics could be a nation's ultimate public relations tool, a catalyst for massive urban renewal and a rebranding of an entire national identity. It set a dangerous, expensive precedent that hosting the Games was a short. It also cemented the television age of the Olympics, transforming them from a live spectacle for hundreds of thousands into a packaged electronic event for hundreds of millions. This new, powerful medium would, just 4 years later, capture an image of protest so iconic that it would forever redefine the relationship between the athlete, the podium, and the world watching at home. The 1968 Mexico City Olympics were destined for controversy from the outset. Awarded to a developing nation at high altitude, they were a bold step for the IOC. But Mexico in 1968 was a nation on a knife's edge. The ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, presented a face of stability and progress, but beneath it festered profound social inequality and political repression. As the Games approached, a student-led movement coalesced, demanding greater democracy, freedom for political prisoners, and an end to police brutality. The movement found a focal point at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in the Tlatelolco housing complex. For weeks, peaceful protests grew. The government, desperate to present a flawless image to the world, grew increasingly paranoid. On the afternoon of October 2, just 10 days before the Olympic opening ceremony, a large student rally filled the plaza. As evening fell, military and police forces surrounded the area. Helicopters dropped flares over the crowd. Then, gunfire erupted. For hours, soldiers and police fired indiscriminately into the mass of students and bystanders. The exact death toll remains shrouded in official secrecy. Estimates range from the government's claim of a few dozen to eyewitness and journalistic accounts suggesting hundreds were killed. Thousands were arrested, and the media was ruthlessly censored. The Tlatelolco massacre was a brutal act of state terror designed to crush dissent on the eve of the global party. The Games opened as scheduled, in a stadium just miles from the blood-stained plaza, with no mention of the atrocity. The world's athletes marched, largely unaware of the horror that had just transpired. It was against this backdrop of suppressed violence that one of the most powerful political statements in sporting history was made. The track and field competition had been electrifying, featuring Bob Beeman's legendary long jump that seemed to defy physics. But the moment that came to define the 1968 Games occurred on the podium for the men's 200-meter final. The gold medal went to Tommy Smith of the United States, who had broken the world record. The bronze went to his fellow American, John Carlos. Both men were black, and both were members of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, an organization founded by sociologist Harry Edwards to protest racial segregation and discrimination in the United States and around the world. The OPHR had initially called for a boycott of the Games by black athletes. While the full boycott didn't materialize, Smith and Carlos decided on a gesture. As the first notes of the Star-Spangled Banner began to play, the two athletes, standing on the podium in black socks and no shoes, to represent black poverty, each raised a single, black-gloved fist into the night air. Smith raised his right, Carlos his left. They bowed their heads. Australian silver medalist Peter Norman, a white man sympathetic to their cause, wore an OPHR badge on his jacket in solidarity. The image was stark, beautiful, and shocking. The raised fist, the Black Power salute, was a symbol of defiance, pride, and a demand for equality. It was a protest against the racism that black Americans faced back home, a gesture that connected the struggle in the US to global anti-colonial movements. The reaction was swift and vicious. The IOC, led by its autocratic president Avery Brundage, condemned the act as a politicization of the Games unsuitable for the apolitical Olympic stage. Smith and Carlos were suspended from the US team and expelled from the Olympic Village. They were vilified in much of the American press, branded as unpatriotic troublemakers. They received death threats and faced professional ostracism upon returning home. Peter Norman, too, was punished by the Australian establishment and was shamefully omitted from their Olympic team for the next Games. The establishment's fury revealed its hypocrisy. Brundage, who had argued the Games must remain apolitical, was the same man who, as head of the American Olympic Committee in 1936, had fought against a boycott of Hitler's Berlin Games and had later insisted the 1972 Munich Games continue after a terrorist massacre. Politics, it seemed, was only unacceptable when it came from the oppressed. For Smith and Carlos, the gesture was deeply personal and profoundly political. "When we won," John Carlos later said, "we were on the podium for all humanity." They used the global spotlight, created by the very television age Tokyo had pioneered, to shine a light on injustice. Their silent protest spoke volumes. It asserted that the black athlete was not just a medal-winning machine for national glory, but a human being with a voice and a cause. It inspired generations of athletes to use their platform for social justice. But the fury it provoked also demonstrated the limits of tolerance within the Olympic framework. The stage was global, but the script was tightly controlled by those in power. Just 4 years later, in Munich, the Olympics would face a violent intrusion that would shatter the illusion of the Games as a protected sanctuary entirely, exposing the IOC's priorities in the most tragic way imaginable. The 1972 Munich Olympics were intended to be the direct antithesis of Berlin 1936. West Germany poured immense resources into creating the Happy Games, a cheerful, peaceful celebration that would showcase a new, democratic and tolerant nation. The architecture was light and airy, the security deliberately low profile to avoid any echo of a police state. For the first 10 days, the plan seemed to work. The world was captivated by the charm of the mascot, Waldy the Dachshund, and the brilliance of swimmers like Mark Spitz, who won an unprecedented 7 gold medals. Then, in the early hours of September 5, the illusion was shattered. 8 members of the Palestinian terrorist group, Black September, clad in tracksuits and carrying duffel bags filled with weapons, scaled the fence of the Olympic Village. They easily entered the poorly secured quarters of the Israeli delegation at 31 Connolly-Strasse. They took 11 Israeli athletes, coaches, and officials hostage, killing 2 who resisted in the initial struggle. What followed was a 20-hour global television drama, a real-time tragedy played out in front of. The terrorists demanded the release of over 200 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, as well as the founders of the German Red Army faction. The German authorities, utterly unprepared and desperate to avoid a bloodbath on live TV, engaged in chaotic negotiations. The IOC, under its president Avery Brundage, made the astonishing decision to continue the Games after a brief 24-hour suspension. Competitions resumed while Israeli lives hung in the balance, a choice that many saw as grotesque. Brundage famously declared, "The Games must go on." The German authorities devised a desperate rescue plan. They agreed to transport the terrorists and their hostages by helicopter to Fürstenfeldbruck NATO airbase, where a Lufthansa jet would be waiting to fly them to Cairo. The authorities told the terrorists that the Egyptian crew was on board the jet, but in reality, the plane was empty. The plan was for German police snipers to pick off the terrorists at the airfield. It was a catastrophic failure. The police were outnumbered and outgunned. There were only 5 snipers for 8 terrorists. The snipers lacked proper communication gear, night vision scopes, and had not been trained for such an operation. When the terrorists realized it was a trap, a fierce firefight erupted. In the chaos, one of the terrorists murdered 4 of the Israeli hostages inside a helicopter with grenades and gunfire. Another 5 were killed in a second helicopter. All but 3 of the terrorists were killed. The final horrific toll: 11 Israelis, 1 German police officer, and 5 terrorists dead. The Munich massacre was a profound trauma for the Olympic movement and the world. It was a brutal lesson in the new realities of international terrorism, where the global media spotlight of the Olympics provided the ultimate stage for political violence. The German authorities' incompetence was staggering, but the IOC's response was, for many, equally damning. After a memorial service attended by 80,000 people in the Olympic Stadium, Brundage insisted the Games continue. "We cannot allow a handful of terrorists to destroy this nucleus of international cooperation and goodwill," he stated. For critics, this decision prioritized spectacle over humanity, treating the murder of athletes as a mere disruption to the schedule. It laid bare a cold, institutional obsession with the Olympic show, an attitude that would have devastating consequences for the credibility of the movement. The Munich Games closed under a cloud of grief and recrimination. The world had seen that the Olympic bubble could be violently popped, and that the authorities entrusted with protecting it were fallible, even reckless. The financial and political costs of hosting the Games were about to enter a new, perilous phase. The 1976 Montreal Olympics were conceived as a modest, self-financing event. Mayor Jean Drapeau famously boasted, "The Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby." It was a statement that would haunt Canada for decades. Plagued by construction delays, labor strikes, and spectacular cost overruns, the Montreal Games became a financial disaster of epic proportions. The futuristic, swooping design of the Olympic Stadium, the Big O, proved a nightmare to build. A prolonged strike by construction workers brought the site to a standstill. When the Games opened, the stadium's iconic retractable roof and the towering inclined tower were unfinished. The final cost ballooned to over $1.5 billion, a debt that took the city and province of Quebec 30 years to pay off. The Big O was derisively renamed the Big O. Montreal's experience served as a stark warning to future host cities. The Olympics were a financial gamble of ruinous proportions. But the political storm that hit Montreal was even more immediate. Just days before the opening ceremony, 26 African nations, led by Tanzania, announced they were boycotting the Games. Their grievance, the inclusion of New Zealand. The New Zealand rugby union team, the All Blacks, had recently toured apartheid South Africa, a nation banned from the Olympics since 1964 due to its racist policies of apartheid. The African nations argued that by allowing New Zealand to participate, the IOC was condoning sporting links with the racist regime. They demanded New Zealand's expulsion. The IOC refused, arguing that rugby was not an Olympic sport and therefore outside its jurisdiction. The boycott went ahead. It was a powerful, disruptive action. For the first time, a large bloc of nations used their absence as a political weapon within the Olympic context. For the affected athletes, it was heartbreaking. Many had trained for years for this moment, only to see it vanish in a geopolitical dispute. The boycott diminished the competition in several events, particularly in track and field. It also signaled a new assertiveness from the Global South, using the Olympic platform to fight a moral cause. The international isolation of apartheid. While the immediate impact on the Games was mixed, the boycott succeeded in drawing global attention to the issue. It put the IOC in a difficult position, caught between its principle of non-interference in a nation's non-Olympic sports and the overwhelming moral imperative of opposing apartheid. The Montreal boycott set a precedent for using the Games as a tool of collective political leverage. It demonstrated that the threat of a mass walkout could shake the Olympic movement to its core. This lesson was not lost on the world superpowers, who were about to engage in the most damaging tit-for-tat boycotts in Olympic history, turning the 1980s into a decade where the Games became a primary battlefield of the Cold War. The Moscow Games of 1980 were a lifelong dream for Soviet leadership. They were to be the ultimate showcase of the achievements of socialism, a grand display of Soviet organizational prowess, athletic might, and hospitality. The USSR poured an estimated $9 billion into the event, building new stadiums, hotels, and infrastructure. It was to be their coming-out party on the world stage. Then, on December 27, 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan to prop up a communist government. The invasion was met with global condemnation. US. President Jimmy Carter, facing a re-election battle and seeking to project strong leadership, saw an opportunity. He issued an ultimatum. If Soviet troops did not withdraw from Afghanistan by February 20, 1980, the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics. The deadline passed. Carter made good on his threat, launching a full-court diplomatic press to rally allies to join the boycott. The move was deeply controversial. Many American athletes were devastated, their lifelong ambitions sacrificed for a geopolitical statement whose effectiveness they doubted. The USS. Olympic Committee, under immense political and financial pressure, ultimately agreed to the boycott. They were joined by over 60 other nations, including Canada, West Germany, Japan, and China. Some key allies, like Great Britain and France, allowed their athletes to choose, and their teams competed under the Olympic flag, not their national banners. The Moscow Games went ahead, but they were deeply diminished. The boycotting nations included many sporting powerhouses, leaving gaps in competition and casting a pall over the victories achieved. The Soviet Union and East Germany dominated a shrunken medal table. The atmosphere was strained, the symbolism of the empty spaces in the stadium, a constant reminder of the global protest. For the athletes who missed out, the pain was personal and lasting. Many never got another chance. The boycott was a blunt instrument, using athletes as political pawns with little evidence. It changed Soviet policy in Afghanistan. It did, however, achieve one of Carter's goals. It spoiled the Soviet Union's perfect party. 4 years later, the Soviet Union and its allies exacted their revenge. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the first to be primarily funded by private corporate money, promised a stark contrast to state-funded Moscow. It was a celebration of American capitalism, entertainment, and technology. But the Cold War logic of the boycott demanded reciprocity. Citing chauvinistic sentiments and an anti-Soviet hysteria being whipped up in the United States and claiming concerns over the safety of their athletes, the Soviet Union announced its boycott of the Los Angeles Games in May 1984. 14 other Eastern Bloc nations followed suit, including East Germany, Bulgaria, and Cuba. Again, the political decision overrode the dreams of thousands of athletes. Again, the competition was skewed, with the United States romping to a record medal haul in the absence of its chief rivals. The tit-for-tat boycotts of 1980 and 1984 represented the absolute nadir of the Olympic ideal. They were a cynical admission that the Games were not a sanctuary from politics, but a primary arena for its expression. The athletes, the very heart of the enterprise, were treated as disposable pieces in a global chess game. The boycotts failed to achieve their stated geopolitical objectives. The Soviets stayed in Afghanistan for nearly a decade, and American hysteria was hardly curtailed. But they did immense damage to the Olympic movement. They devalued the medals won, created generations of embittered athletes, and revealed the IOC as a powerless bystander in the face of superpower conflict. The IOC's inability to prevent these boycotts highlighted its lack of real authority. The only winner seemed to be the 1984 Los Angeles Organizing Committee, which, under Peter Ueberroth's shrewd management, turned a massive profit, proving the Games could be commercially viable. This financial success, however, opened a new Pandora's box. The era of the boycott gradually receded with the warming of Cold War relations, culminating in the peaceful coexistence of the 1988 Seoul Games. But the lesson had been learned. The Olympics were too valuable, too visible, to be immune from the world's conflicts. As the ideological battles of the Cold War faded, a new force, even more pervasive and potentially corrupting, was poised to take center stage, transforming the Olympics from a political battleground into a commercialized global brand. This brings us to commercialization and scandal. Commercialization and scandal. The Olympic flame, that ancient symbol of purity and striving, arrived in Los Angeles in the summer of 1984 under a cloud of skepticism and a mountain of debt. The ghosts of Montreal's financial ruin, a billion-dollar burden that would take 30 years to lift, haunted every conversation about hosting the Games. The Soviet-led boycott, a retaliatory strike for the American absence in Moscow 4 years prior, threatened to hollow out the competition. And yet, against this bleak backdrop, a revolution was quietly being staged. Not on the track or in the pool, but in the boardrooms and marketing suites. The 1984 Olympics would become a watershed, not for who wasn't there, but for how they were paid for. This was the dawn of the fully commercialized Games, a transformation so profound it would redefine the very soul of the Olympic movement, setting it on a collision course between its lofty ideals and the relentless pressures of the global marketplace. The architect of this revolution was a man who had never run an Olympic committee, Peter Ueberroth, a travel industry executive whose vision was as American as the corporate logos he would so brilliantly enlist. His mandate was simple: avoid bankruptcy. His method was radical. The Games would not be funded by public money, but by private enterprise. The Olympic movement, long reliant on the munificence of host cities and nations, was about to become a business. Ueberroth's genius was in perceiving the Olympics not as a sporting event, but as the world's most powerful branding opportunity. He created a tiered sponsorship model, an exclusive club where a select group of corporations, for a then astronomical sum of $4 million each, could claim an official association with the Five Rings. This was not mere advertising, it was anointment. Companies like Coca-Cola, Anheuser-Busch, and Levi's bought into a global narrative of excellence and unity. The exclusivity was key, only one company per category, which turned the Olympic sponsorship into a coveted trophy, a way to outflank competitors on a world stage. Furthermore, Uberoth masterfully monetized the television rights, driving a hard bargain with the networks that saw the fees skyrocket. He even innovated with the torch relay, charging communities for the honor of having the flame pass through their towns, turning a sacred ritual into a fundraiser. The result was staggering. The Los Angeles Games, expected to be a burden, turned a profit of over $200 million. The message was deafening. The Olympics could be a gold mine. The impact of Los Angeles '84 cannot be overstated. It saved the Olympic movement from financial irrelevance, making bidding for the Games desirable again. No longer were they a surefire path to debt, they were now a potential engine of economic growth and global prestige. But this salvation came with a Faustian bargain. The Olympic ideal, as conceived by Pierre de Coubertin, was one of amateurism, of competition for its own sake, free from the corrupting influence of commerce. Uberoth's model blew that concept apart. The Games were now irrevocably tied to corporate capital. The 5 rings, once a symbol of pure sport, were now also a trademark, a brand to be leveraged and protected. The athletes, still officially amateur in 1984, could see the billions flowing around them, and the pressure to monetize their own fleeting moment of glory would become irresistible. Los Angeles was a triumph of American capitalism, a spectacle of sun-drenched optimism and flawless execution. But it planted the seeds for the contradictions to come, the tension between spirit and sponsorship, between global unity and commercial rivalry. The Olympics were now a product, and like any product they had to be sold, protected and defended no matter the cost. The race for profit had begun, and it would soon run parallel to the races on the track, sometimes with devastating consequences. Just 4 years later, on the other side of the Pacific, the dark shadow cast by the new commercial stakes began to take a terrifyingly human form. The 1988 Seoul Olympics were a statement. South Korea, emerging from war and dictatorship, presented itself as a modern, technological powerhouse, a nation ready to take its place on the world stage. The Games were impeccably organized, a spectacle of precision and pride. And on the track, the defining duel of the Games was set, the 100-meter final, a showdown between Canada's Ben Johnson and America's Carl Lewis. It was more than a race. It was a clash of personalities, of nations, of styles. Lewis, the clean-cut All-American, versus Johnson, the powerful, scowling immigrant from Jamaica. The world watched. And when Johnson exploded from the blocks, churning down the track with seemingly superhuman force, leaving Lewis in his wake to smash the world record with a time of 9.79 seconds, it felt like witnessing a revolution in human speed. He was immortalized in that instant, a glowering golden icon, his finger raised to the sky. The immortality lasted 48 hours. The news, when it broke, sent a seismic shock through the world of sport and far beyond. Ben Johnson had tested positive for the anabolic steroid stanozolol. His gold medal was stripped, his world record erased. The image of him hanging his head, being whisked away from Seoul in disgrace, replaced the triumphant pose. The dirtiest race in history was not just about one man's fall from grace. It was the moment the veil was ripped away. For years, rumors had swirled about systematic doping in athletics, particularly from the state-sponsored programs of the Eastern Bloc. But this was different. This was the blue rebound event of the Olympics, the champion of champions, caught red-handed. Johnson's coach, Charlie Francis, would later reveal a culture of calculated chemical enhancement, a cold, logical arms race where the choice was to dope or be left behind. The scandal exposed the International Olympic Committee's anti-doping efforts as tragically naive and hopelessly behind the science. The test that caught Johnson was almost not administered. It was a new, more sophisticated analysis that detected the steroid. The cheaters were ahead of the testers. The fallout from Seoul was a crisis of faith. If the world's fastest man was a fraud, what could be believed? The Johnson scandal made it clear that doping was not the exception, but a systemic feature of high-stakes sport. The commercial pressures born in Los Angeles had raised the stakes exponentially. An Olympic gold medal was no longer just a laurel wreath, it was a ticket to global fame and fortune, to multi-million-dollar endorsements, to a lifetime of security. The temptation to find an edge, any edge, became overwhelming for athletes, coaches, and federations. The human body had its limits, but the rewards for surpassing them were now limitless. Johnson became the scapegoat, a solitary villain for a vast problem. But his story was a warning siren, a piercing alarm that the Olympic ideal was being poisoned, literally and figuratively, by the very forces that now sustained it. The race was no longer just against the clock or the competitor next to you, it was against a shadowy, sophisticated network of chemists and enablers. The age of innocence was over. The Olympics now had to wage a war. It was ill-equipped to fight, a war for its own credibility, with the Ben Johnson scandal as its brutal, defining battle. Amidst the wreckage of Seoul's scandal, the Olympic movement sought a new kind of hero, one that could transcend sport and capture the global imagination. They would find it, spectacularly, in Barcelona in 1992. But these heroes did not emerge from the traditional Olympic crucible of track and field. They came from the hardwood courts of the NBA. For decades, Olympic basketball had been governed by the fading ideal of amateurism. The United States, the birthplace of the game, sent college players, talented but callow, and they usually won. But in 1988, with a team of college stars, they lost in the semi-finals to the Soviet Union. The world had caught up. The response, for Barcelona, was seismic. For the first time, professional basketball players, the gods of the NBA, would be allowed to compete. The result was the Dream Team, a collection of talent so luminous it redefined the sport globally. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, the roster, read like a Hall of Fame induction list. Their practice sessions were more scrutinized than most countries' gold medal matches. They didn't just beat their opponents, they mesmerized them. They played with a joyful, devastating artistry, winning games by an average of 44 points. Opponents asked for their autographs after being demolished on the court. The cultural impact of the Dream Team was immeasurable. They were the embodiment of American cool, a force of nature that globalized the NBA overnight. For millions around the world, watching them in Barcelona was a revelation. Basketball became a universal language. The Dream Team's presence also marked the final, definitive end of amateurism as an Olympic principle. If the greatest basketball players in the world were professionals, why should a sprinter or a swimmer not also profit from their talent? The hypocrisy of the old model was laid bare. The Olympics were now openly a stage for the world's best, regardless of their paychecks. This professionalization, however, further accelerated the commercial machine. These athletes were global brands unto themselves, and their participation brought unprecedented media and marketing attention. The Dream Team was the perfect fusion of sporting excellence and marketability, a symbol of the new, commercial Olympics that was both awe-inspiring and, in its sheer dominance, a little unsettling. They were less a team, and more a corporate-sponsored spectacle of invincibility. The 1992 Games were also defined by a profound geopolitical shift. The unified team that marched into the opening ceremony was a temporary, poignant entity. It represented the former Soviet Union, which had formally dissolved just months before the Games. Athletes from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and other newly independent states competed under the Olympic flag, their victories marked by the Olympic anthem. It was a strange, transitional moment, a team without a country, a symbol of the old order clinging to existence for one last sporting contest. The emotional resonance was powerful. These athletes had trained their entire lives under the Soviet system, with its notorious state-sponsored doping regimens and immense pressure for ideological victory. Now, that system was gone. They competed for themselves, for each other, and for the abstract idea of the Olympic spirit. Their success, finishing atop the medal table, was a testament to the sporting infrastructure of a vanished empire. Barcelona became a farewell to the Cold War Olympic rivalry that had defined the Games for decades, and a hesitant first step into a new, more fragmented but commercially unified world. The grand ideological battle between East and West was over, replaced by a new, more diffuse competition. The battle for global market share, for branding supremacy, for the allegiance of a worldwide audience. The Olympics had survived the end of a world order, but its soul was now inexorably tied to the logic of the marketplace. The centennial of the modern Olympic Games was a homecoming of sorts. In 1996, the Olympics returned to the United States, to Atlanta, Georgia, a city that sold itself as the vibrant, modern face of the American South. The Games were a sprawling, chaotic celebration, heavily commercialized, with a mascot, the abstract, computer-generated Izzy, that seemed to embody the confusing new era. The organizing committee, led by Billy Payne, pursued a model even more aggressively corporate than Los Angeles, with a dense forest of sponsorship booths in the Centennial Olympic Park, a central gathering place for fans. It was here, in the early hours of July 27th, during a late-night concert, that the modern Olympic experience was violently shattered. A pipe bomb hidden in a knapsack exploded. The blast killed spectator Alice Hawthorne, injured 101 others, and caused a fatal heart attack to a Turkish journalist. The world watched in horror as the joyous celebration turned into a scene of terror and triage. The Atlanta bombing was a traumatic pivot point. Security at the Olympics had always been tight, particularly since the tragedy in Munich in 1972. But Atlanta demonstrated that even the most extensive measures could be breached by a determined, lone actor. The perpetrator, Eric Rudolph, an anti-government and anti-abortion extremist, had chosen the global stage of the Olympics to amplify his hateful message. The response from authorities, initially chaotic, would come to define the future of the Games. In the immediate aftermath, the focus shifted. The celebration was overshadowed by the investigation, by the manhunt, by a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The Olympics were no longer just a sporting festival or a corporate showcase. They were now a top-tier security target. The imperative to secure the Games would henceforth become the primary logistical and financial burden for every host city, often dwarfing the costs of the sporting venues themselves. The legacy of Atlanta is a paradox. The Games continued, and there were magnificent athletic achievements. The brilliance of sprinter Michael Johnson, the dominance of the US women's gymnastics team. But the shadow of the bomb was inescapable. It signaled that the Olympics, in their global prominence, had become a magnet for all the pathologies and conflicts of the world they sought to transcend. The subsequent Games would become fortresses. Sydney, Athens, Beijing, London, each implemented increasingly sophisticated, militarized, and intrusive security regimes, rings of steel, biometric screening, no-fly zones, and legions of armed personnel. The open, accessible festival atmosphere that Atlanta's Centennial Park was meant to embody was forever compromised. The Olympics became a security spectacle, where the smooth management of risk was as important as the breaking of world records. The price of global relevance was eternal vigilance, turning the celebration of peace into a lockdown siege. As the Millennium turned, the Olympic movement sought redemption, a story to counter the cynicism of doping and the trauma of terrorism. They found it in the harbour city of Sydney, Australia, in the year 2000, and it was embodied by one woman, Cathy Freeman. An Indigenous Australian, Freeman carried the hopes of a nation grappling with its own history. For centuries, Australia's First Peoples had suffered dispossession, discrimination, and profound injustice. The Olympics became an unlikely arena for a national conversation about reconciliation. Freeman was not just an athlete, she was a symbol. Her choice to carry both the Australian and the Aboriginal flags during her victory laps was a quiet, powerful statement. And the nation held its breath for her one-woman final, the 400 meters. Dressed in a distinctive full-body green and gold suit, Freeman stood alone on the track before the race, a figure of intense concentration and immense pressure. The weight of history was on her shoulders, the hopes of her people, the expectations of a nation wanting to celebrate a unifying hero. When the gun fired, she ran a perfect race, commanding from the front and holding off a fierce challenge. As she crossed the line to win gold, the stadium and the country erupted in a cathartic roar. Freeman didn't just run a lap of honor, she sat on the track, removed her shoes, and simply breathed, a moment of pure, exhausted release. Her victory was more than a sporting achievement. It was a national moment of reckoning and hope. It presented a vision of what Australia could be, a nation that celebrated its Indigenous heritage as a central part of its identity. The Sydney Games were widely hailed as a triumph of organisation and spirit, the best Olympics ever, in the popular refrain. Freeman's run was its beating heart, a powerful demonstration of sport's potential to heal and unite. But even as Sydney shone, a corrupt undercurrent was about to erupt, threatening to destroy the Olympic movement from within. The scandal had been brewing for years, in the shadowy world of bid city campaigns. To host the Olympics had become the ultimate prize for cities, a chance for global branding and urban renewal. The competition was ferocious, and the rules were vague. The revelation, in late 1998, was explosive. Members of the International Olympic Committee had been systematically bribed by the bid committee for Salt Lake City, which would host the 2002 Winter Games. The gifts were not subtle, lavish vacations, college scholarships for members' children, cash payments, and medical treatments. It was a quid pro quo system, where votes were bought and sold. The scandal laid bare the grotesque hypocrisy at the highest level of the Olympic movement. While athletes were punished for taking drugs to enhance performance, the old men who governed them were accepting envelopes of cash to enhance a city's prospects. The fallout was swift and severe. Several IOC members were expelled or resigned. The organization, led by its new president Jacques Rogge, was forced to enact sweeping reforms, banning members from visiting bid cities, establishing an ethics commission, and tightening the rules on gifts. The Salt Lake City scandal shattered the illusion of the IOC as a benevolent guardian of pure ideals. It was revealed as a political body, susceptible to the same greed and corruption found in any powerful institution. The bidding process itself was tainted, forcing a fundamental rethink of how host cities are chosen. More deeply, the scandal damaged the moral authority of the Olympics. If the guardians of the flame were corrupt, what did that say about the flame itself? It was a crisis of governance that mirrored the athletic crisis of doping. Both revealed a system under immense strain, where the rewards, whether a gold medal or the prestige of hosting, had grown so large that they tempted individuals to break the very rules they were sworn to uphold. Sydney's glorious heights and Salt Lake's sordid depths existed simultaneously, a stark illustration of the Olympic paradox at the turn of the century. From the corporate salvation of Los Angeles to the corrupt underbelly of Salt Lake City, the final 2 decades of the 20th century transformed the Olympic Games forever. They were now a financial juggernaut and a security fortress, a platform for transcendent cultural moments and a stage for scandal. The idealism of the amateur was gone, replaced by the professional and the commercial. The simple joy of competition was now layered with the complexities of geopolitics, national identity, and global business. The Olympics had grown in scale, wealth, and visibility, but with that growth came profound vulnerabilities. The movement had navigated the end of the Cold War, only to find itself in a new war against doping, against terrorism, and against its own corruption. It had discovered its power to unite, as with Cathy Freeman, and its propensity for disgrace, as with Ben Johnson and the IOC members. As the 5 rings spun into the 21st century, they carried with them this accumulated weight, the brilliance and the burden, the hope and the hypocrisy, all shining under the same unforgiving global spotlight. The quest for profit, for glory, for security, and for purity would only intensify, creating ever more dramatic contradictions in the games to come. This brings us to The new millennium's contradictions. The new millennium's contradictions. The Olympic Games. For over a century, they have presented themselves as a pure ideal, a timeless gathering of humanity's finest, competing not for nation or glory, but for the sake of sport itself. A flame lit in antiquity, passed from hand to hand across continents, a symbol of peace and universal brotherhood. But as that flame entered the 21st century, carried across the threshold of the year 2000, it began to illuminate a different landscape. The modern Olympic project, born in the industrial age and magnified by the television age, now faced the complexities of a globalized, fractured, and hyper-commercial new millennium. The ideals remained, etched in marble and repeated in countless speeches, but the ground upon which the stadiums were built had shifted. What followed was a series of spectacular, contradictory chapters, each Olympiad a world in miniature, reflecting not just athletic prowess but the pressing fears, political ambitions, and social fissures of its time. This is the story of the Olympics in the 21st century, a story of breathtaking achievement shadowed by profound doubt, of regeneration stained by ruin, and of a cherished institution grappling with its own gargantuan scale. It is a story that begins, fittingly, with a return to the source, a homecoming to the spiritual birthplace of the Games, where ancient dreams confronted modern realities. Athens, 2004. The narrative was irresistible, a storybook return. After a century of global wanderings, the Olympics were coming home. The bid was emotional, powerful, and successful. Greece, a nation of just 11 million people, would host the world. It was to be a celebration of heritage, a direct link between the marble stadia of antiquity and the sleek new structures of the 21st century. The shot-put competition was even held in the ancient stadium at Olympia, a poetic gesture of profound resonance. But the poetry was swiftly overtaken by a relentless, punishing prose. The project was plagued by delays of almost mythical proportions. Just 2 years before the opening ceremony, the main Olympic site was a barren tract of land. Construction cranes became a more common symbol of Athens than the Parthenon. The world watched with mounting anxiety as Greece raced against time, a race that escalated costs to a staggering, ultimately crippling $13 billion. The financial burden would become an anchor on the Greek economy for decades, a contributing factor to the nation's subsequent debt crisis. The dream homecoming was becoming a fiscal nightmare, but the anxieties of 2004 were not merely financial. The world had changed irrevocably since the Games were awarded to Athens. The attacks of September 11, 2001 cast a long, dark shadow over any global gathering. The Olympics, a symbol of open borders and peaceful congregation, now represented the ultimate soft target. Athens 2004 became the first security games. A NATO security umbrella was deployed. A fleet of AWACS surveillance planes patrolled the skies. The Greek government installed a network of cameras so extensive it transformed the city into a panopticon. Over €1 billion were spent on security alone, a sum that dwarfed the entire budget of the Sydney Games just 4 years prior. The joyful return was now wrapped in a cocoon of razor wire and fear. The atmosphere on the ground was a strange cocktail of celebration and siege. Athletes moved between venues in armed convoys. Spectators passed through airport-level screening. The sense of carefree festival that had characterized earlier games was subdued, replaced by a palpable, low-grade tension. The homecoming was secure, but at the cost of its own spirit. And then, when the last medal was awarded and the final spectator departed, Athens was left with its legacy. The post-games landscape told its own story. Many of the dazzling, purpose-built venues, constructed in that frantic final sprint, began a swift decay. The Olympic softball stadium became a dust bowl. The canoe slalom course sat dry and cracked. The sprawling complex at Hellenikon, the old airport, fell into haunting disrepair. These modern ruins stood as stark, concrete counterpoints to the timeless ruins of the Acropolis. They were monuments not to athletic glory, but to overreach, to the fleeting nature of the Olympic spectacle. The Greek people, initially proud hosts, were left to grapple with the bill and the white elephants. The Athens Olympics posed a fundamental, unsettling question. If the Games could do this to their own birthplace, what hope was there for any other city? It was a cautionary tale written in the marble dust of antiquity and the crumbling concrete of the modern era. The homecoming had revealed a painful truth: you can't go home again, at least not without paying a devastating price. 4 years later, the Olympic caravan moved to a city that represented the absolute opposite of intimate, historic Athens. Beijing 2008 was a statement, not a homecoming. It was the arrival of a new superpower on the world's most prestigious stage. China seized the Olympic moment not merely to host a sporting event, but to orchestrate a national unveiling, a meticulously choreographed performance of power, discipline, and prosperity. The scale was imperial. The budget, officially reported but widely believed to be vastly higher, exceeded $40 billion. The centerpiece was the Bird's Nest Stadium, a breathtaking lattice of steel, and the Watercube Aquatic Center, both architectural marvels that instantly became global icons. The opening ceremony, masterminded by filmmaker Zhang Yimou, was a staggering, synchronized spectacle involving 15,000 performers, a display of human coordination and technological might that left the world awestruck. It was a definitive message. China was no longer the sleeping giant, but a disciplined, modern, and formidable force. The Games were a soft power coup of historic proportions, a 21st century version of a coronation. Yet, behind the dazzling spectacle, a drumbeat of controversy grew louder in the years and months leading up to the Games. Awarding the Olympics to China had been contentious from the start, a reward to a nation with a deeply troubling human rights record. Activists and governments used the impending Games as leverage, a global spotlight to shine on China's policies in Tibet, its treatment of dissidents, and its support for regimes in Sudan and elsewhere. The phrase "genocide Olympics" was used by some critics. The Chinese government, for its part, made some concessions, allowing limited access to foreign journalists, for instance, but also intensified its controls. Dissent was stifled, activists were detained, the promised improvements in human rights were largely sidelined by the imperative of a flawless presentation. The Olympic torch relay, meant to symbolize global unity, became a global protest, met with pro-Tibet demonstrations in cities from London to San Francisco. The Games themselves were seamlessly executed, but they unfolded within a carefully sanitized bubble. A protest zones plan was announced but rendered useless by bureaucratic hurdles. The spectacle was undeniable, but it came at the cost of the Olympic ideal of open dialogue and freedom of expression. The world watched the show, but many wondered what they weren't being shown. And then there was the environment. Beijing's air pollution was a notorious, visible fact. In a bid to clear the skies for the Blue Sky Games, the government enacted drastic measures. Factories hundreds of miles away were shuttered, construction halted, half the city's cars were ordered off the roads based on odd-even license plate numbers. The measures worked, to a degree. The skies did clear, but it was a temporary, artificial fix. Athletes arrived with masks and concerns about competing in the thick air. Some, like the famed Ethiopian runner Haile Gebrselassie, opted out of the marathon altogether, fearing permanent damage to his health. The clear skies during the Games only highlighted the pervasive smog that returned once the temporary controls were lifted. The Smog Games became a potent symbol of the contradictions of rapid, unchecked development. China had built the most impressive Olympic stage ever seen, but it could not guarantee the basic quality of the air above it. The 2008 Olympics were thus a masterpiece of stagecraft, a breathtaking demonstration of what a centralized, authoritarian state could achieve when it marshaled all its resources toward a single goal. But the perfection of the spectacle only deepened the questions about what was being concealed, controlled, and ultimately commodified in the name of Olympic glory. The pendulum swung again in 2012. London presented a deliberate, conscious alternative to both the ancient gravitas of Athens and the monolithic spectacle of Beijing. Its bid was won not on grandeur, but on regeneration. The focus was a neglected, post-industrial wasteland in East London, a tangled mix of derelict factories, toxic soil, and poor communities. The Olympic Park would be a catalyst, a surgical intervention to heal a part of the city that had been left behind. The narrative was pragmatic, forward-looking, and community-focused. The budget, though huge, was transparent and largely adhered to. The architecture, like the twisting, latticed orbit tower and the elegant velodrome, was impressive, but not ostentatious. London promised a Games that were sustainable, both in construction and in legacy. It was a bid built on a promise of tangible, lasting benefit for the people of London, not just a 2-week party for the world. And then, during the Games themselves, something magical happened. The weather, notoriously fickle, turned glorious. The British athletes, buoyed by a home crowd, performed beyond all expectation. And then came Super Saturday, August 4, 2012, a day etched permanently into British sporting consciousness. In the space of just 44 minutes inside the Olympic Stadium, Jessica Owens won the heptathlon, Greg Rutherford won the long jump, and Mo Farah won the 10,000 meters. 3 gold medals for Team GB, each met with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. It was a spontaneous, explosive moment of pure joy, a national catharsis that transcended sport. The often cynical British public was utterly swept up in a wave of unadulterated enthusiasm. The Games felt inclusive, joyful, and surprisingly cool, capped by a closing ceremony that celebrated British pop culture with whimsical charm. For a brief, shining fortnight, London 2012 seemed to have cracked the code, a well-managed, human-scaled Olympics that delivered both sporting magic and genuine civic pride. The true test, however, was always going to be the legacy, and here, London's story is more nuanced, but stands in stark contrast to the ruins of Athens. The Olympic Park did not become a ghost town. It was deliberately designed for transformation. The stadium became the home of West Ham United Football Club. The aquatic centre was scaled down for community use. The athletes' village became a new residential quarter. The area, rebranded as Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, is now a thriving district with schools, health centres, and businesses. The transportation links built for the Games permanently improved connectivity in East London. While not without its criticisms, gentrification pressures, questions about the affordability of the new housing, the project largely delivered on its core promise of physical regeneration. London 2012 demonstrated that with meticulous planning, transparency, and a clear post-Games vision, the Olympic burden could be managed and even leveraged for long-term good. It offered a blueprint, a proof of concept that the Olympics could be more than a costly vanity project. But it also set a high bar, one that would prove dauntingly difficult for the next host city to reach. That next city was Rio de Janeiro in 2016, and the contrast could not have been more dramatic. Where London was a model of planning and control, Rio was a carnival of chaos, a Games perpetually on the brink. The problems began early and piled high. Brazil was sliding into its worst economic recession in a century. A sprawling corruption scandal, known as Operation Car Wash, engulfed the country's political and business elite, implicating many involved in Olympic construction. The governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro declared a financial emergency mere months before the Games, begging for federal bailouts to pay police and fund essential services. The political turmoil was mirrored by a public health crisis, the Zika virus. This mosquito-borne illness, linked to severe birth defects, sparked global panic. Top athletes, including golfers and tennis stars, withdrew from the Games, citing health concerns. Pregnant women were advised not to travel to Rio. The imagery of the tropical paradise was suddenly overwritten with warnings of a lurking, invisible threat. The environmental promises, a key part of Rio's bid, collapsed completely. Guanabara Bay, the stunning natural harbour that was the venue for sailing, was a toxic soup of raw sewage and floating garbage. Athletes were advised not to let the water touch their faces, to cover any open wounds, and to shower immediately after competition. Tests revealed dangerous levels of viruses and bacteria. The cleanup, promised so confidently during the bid, had failed utterly. Similarly, the lagoon for the rowing and canoeing events was also polluted, with debris and foul odors plaguing the competitions. The world watched as athletes navigated not just their opponents, but also plastic bags and dead fish. It was a visceral, embarrassing failure of governance that turned a sporting event into a public health hazard. The very beauty of Rio's natural setting became the backdrop for an environmental disgrace. Yet, amidst this turmoil, Rio 2016 produced one of the most powerful and poignant moments in Olympic history, the debut of the refugee Olympic team. 10 athletes, forced from their homes by conflict and persecution, marched into the Maracana Stadium under the Olympic flag. They competed not for a nation, but for all those displaced around the world. This gesture, born from the global refugee crisis, was a direct and conscious re-engagement with the Olympic ideal of peace and humanity. It was a stark, beautiful counter-narrative to the surrounding dysfunction. In the same games, Simone Biles redefined gymnastics, Usain Bolt cemented his legend with a triple-triple, and Michael Phelps added to his impossible medal haul. The sporting action, as always, provided moments of transcendence, but they unfolded in a city visibly struggling under the weight of the event. The legacy for Rio was bleak: colossal debt, abandoned venues, and a deepening of the city's social and economic crises. The marvelous city was left with a monumental hangover, a cautionary tale of what happens when the Olympics meet a nation in political and economic freefall. The strains exposed in Rio were a prelude to a far greater, global disruption. Tokyo 2020 was supposed to be a redemption narrative, a sleek, efficient, technologically advanced games that would showcase a resilient Japan after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Then, a pandemic swept the globe. In an unprecedented move, the games were postponed for a year. The delay created a surreal limbo. Athletes' training cycles were shattered. The astronomical costs, already high, ballooned further. The Japanese public, initially supportive, grew increasingly fearful and opposed as the pandemic dragged on. When the Games finally opened in the summer of 2021, they were like no other. The stadiums were empty, devoid of the roaring crowds that are the lifeblood of Olympic competition. Athletes competed in an eerie silence, their triumphs and heartbreaks echoing in vast, vacant bowls. The much-touted Festival of Humanity became a strictly controlled, biosecure television production. The psychological toll on the athletes was immense. They had trained for a peak at the wrong time, isolated for months, and now performed in a void. The pressure, without the balancing energy of a crowd, became crushing. The world witnessed a new, more vulnerable generation of athletes speaking openly about mental health. Simone Biles, the greatest gymnast of all time, withdrew from multiple finals, citing the twisties and prioritizing her mental well-being. Tennis star Naomi Osaka, who lit the Olympic cauldron, spoke of the overwhelming pressure. Their actions sparked a global conversation, shifting the narrative from mere physical endurance to the holistic health of the competitor. The Tokyo Games, defined by absence and anxiety, forced a reckoning with the very human cost of the Olympic machine. They were games of solitude, a stripped-back, strange spectacle that asked whether the event could still hold its meaning without its audience, and whether the pursuit of medals was worth the breaking of minds and spirits. This trajectory, from the costly homecoming of Athens, through the spectacular power of Beijing, the regenerative hope of London, the chaotic struggle of Rio, to the isolated pause of Tokyo, reveals an inexorable trend: the rising cost, and the rapidly decreasing willingness of cities to host the Olympic Games. The financial model is breaking. The price tags now run into the tens of billions, with rampant cost overruns being the rule, not the exception. The bids are no longer a competition of ambition, but of risk assessment. The 2022 Winter Games had only 2 bid cities. The 2024 Summer Games essentially had to be handed to Paris when other candidates dropped out. The public, in democratic nations, has become skeptical, often hostile. Referendums in potential host cities from Hamburg to Calgary to Boston have resulted in resounding no votes. The promises of economic windfalls are now met with well-founded skepticism, the legacy of white elephants too fresh in the memory. The International Olympic Committee, once a courted kingmaker, now finds itself pleading with cities to take on the burden, offering watered-down reforms and vague promises of austerity. The gigantism of the event, with its demand for flawless security, custom-built arenas, and global media spectacle, has priced out all but the most authoritarian states or the most recklessly optimistic democracies. The Olympic movement is facing a buyer's strike. The flame still burns, the athletes still dream, the moments of superhuman achievement still captivate the world. But the vessel that contains this magic, the modern Olympic Games as a rotating, hosted mega-event, is cracking under its own weight. We are left with a series of powerful, contradictory images: the runner in the empty stadium, the refugee carrying the Olympic flag, the decaying concrete in Athens, the pristine, silent pools in Tokyo, the polluted waters of Rio, the joyful crowds of London. The ideals of peace, unity, and human excellence persist, but they are increasingly at odds with the commercial, political, and logistical realities of the event built to enshrine them. The 21st century Olympics have become the world's most magnificent paradox, a mirror reflecting our deepest aspirations and our most stubborn failures. This brings us to, what are the Games becoming?